Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. when Florida State Trooper Truett Rowlerson first noticed the silver Nissan Altima weaving across the fog line on Interstate 75, somewhere between mile marker 63 and 64 on the stretch of highway that locals called Alligator Alley. The vehicle wasn't swerving dramatically enough to suggest severe impairment, but the subtle drift into the shoulder every quarter mile told Rowlerson's experienced eye that the driver was either exhausted, distracted, or operating under some degree of chemical influence that was compromising their ability to maintain lane discipline on one of Florida's most unforgiving highways. Rowlerson had been patrolling this section of I-75 for nearly 11 years, long enough to know that Alligator Alley was unlike any other interstate corridor in the state, perhaps in the entire country. The 78-mile stretch of elevated roadway cut straight through the heart of the Everglades, surrounded on both sides by sawgrass marshes, cypress swamps, and waterways teeming with alligators that gave the highway its nickname and its reputation as one of the most isolated stretches of major interstate in the continental United States. During daylight hours, Alligator Alley carried a steady stream of traffic between the Gulf Coast cities of Naples and Fort Myers on the western terminus and the sprawling urban expanse of Fort Lauderdale and Miami on the eastern end. Tourists heading to beach resorts, commercial trucks hauling goods between coasts, and local residents commuting between the distinctly different worlds of Florida's Atlantic and Gulf regions all used the highway as the fastest route across the state's southern peninsula. But after midnight, particularly during the humid summer months when fog rolled in from the wetlands and reduced visibility to mere yards, the highway transformed into something altogether different. The darkness beyond the reach of headlights was absolute and impenetrable, broken only by the occasional reflective eyes of wildlife watching the road from the safety of the marshes, and the isolation was so complete that a breakdown or accident could leave travelers stranded for an hour or more before help arrived, assuming help could even locate them in the featureless expanse of wetlands that stretched for miles in every direction. Rowlerson had responded to enough accidents on Alligator Alley to understand the unique dangers posed by driver fatigue on this particular stretch of highway. The road was almost perfectly straight for miles at a time, with minimal visual stimulation beyond the endless parade of white dashes marking the center line and the hypnotic rhythm of reflective markers along the shoulder. Studies had shown that monotonous highway conditions could induce a form of highway hypnosis, where drivers operated their vehicles in a semi-conscious state, their attention drifting as their brains disengaged from the repetitive task of maintaining course and speed on an unchanging roadway. The phenomenon was responsible for numerous single-vehicle accidents, where drivers simply drifted off the road and into the drainage canals that paralleled the highway, their vehicles discovered hours later submerged in water thick with vegetation and inhabited by creatures that saw human intrusion as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. The silver Altima continued its subtle weaving pattern as Rowlerson followed at a safe distance, documenting the vehicle's behavior while running the license plate through his mobile data terminal. The plate came back registered to a rental company out of Fort Lauderdale, which wasn't unusual given the heavy tourist traffic that used Alligator Alley as a shortcut to the Gulf Coast beaches and the Naples shopping districts that attracted visitors from around the world. Rental vehicles presented their own set of complications during traffic stops, as the registered owner would be the rental company rather than the driver, requiring additional verification steps to confirm the identity of the person actually operating the vehicle and their authorization to be driving a car that didn't belong to them. Rollerson activated his emergency lights at mile marker 64, the red and blue strobes cutting through the humid darkness and reflecting off the moisture that hung in the air like a living presence. The Altima's response was immediate but strange, the vehicle slowing gradually and pulling onto the shoulder with almost exaggerated care, as if the driver was making a conscious effort to demonstrate compliance and cooperation with the traffic stop in ways that went beyond what would be expected from a typical motorist who had been caught committing a minor violation. Most drivers, when confronted with emergency lights in their rearview mirror, displayed some combination of anxiety, frustration, or resignation, their body language and vehicle handling revealing their emotional state even before any verbal interaction began. Some would brake hard in panic, others would take excessive time to find a safe place to stop, and a few would attempt to continue driving while pretending not to notice the patrol car behind them, their desperation to avoid the consequences of their actions overriding their better judgment. But the Altima's driver seemed almost eager to stop, pulling over with a precision that suggested either extensive experience with traffic stops or a calculated attempt to appear cooperative in ways that might influence the outcome of the encounter. Rollerson positioned his patrol car at the standard angle behind the Altima, offset slightly to the left to provide protection from passing traffic and ensure that his vehicle's emergency lights would alert other motorists to the presence of a traffic stop in progress. He took a moment to observe the Altima through his windshield, looking for any signs of unusual activity inside the vehicle, additional passengers, movements suggesting the concealment of contraband, or preparations for flight or confrontation that might indicate the stop was more complicated than a routine lane violation citation. The Altima sat motionless on the shoulder, its hazard lights now activated in addition to the brake lights, which remained illuminated despite the vehicle having come to a complete stop. Rollerson could see a single occupant in the driver's seat, but the darkness and the angle of observation made it impossible to determine gender, age, or other identifying characteristics without approaching the vehicle for direct contact. He keyed his radio to inform dispatch of the traffic stop, providing his location, the license plate number, and the nature of the violation he had observed, following the standard protocol that ensured someone would know where he was and what he was doing if the situation evolved in unexpected ways. FHP Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm Code 6 at mile marker 64 on I-75 westbound. Traffic stop on a silver Nissan Altima, Florida rental plate. Observed lane violation. Single occupant visible. I'll advise when I'm Code 4. Rollerson transmitted, his voice carrying the practiced calm that came from having made this same notification thousands of times over his 11-year career on Alligator Alley. The response came back immediately in the distinctive voice of Ione Sutterfield, the veteran dispatcher who had been working the overnight shift at Florida Highway Patrol's Fort Myers Communications Center for longer than Rollerson had been on the force. Sutterfield's voice carried a gravelly quality that suggested years of coffee consumption and cigarette breaks, but her professionalism and attention to detail were legendary among the troopers who depended on her to maintain awareness of their locations and activities during the long, isolated hours of overnight patrol in some of Florida's most remote regions. Copy 47. I show you Code 6 at mile marker 64, westbound I-75. Time is 02:51 hours. Be safe out there. It's been quiet tonight and you know what that means, Sutterfield replied, her comment about the quiet night carrying an implication that experienced officers understood all too well. The nights that started out calm and uneventful often evolved into something altogether different without warning or preparation time. Rollerson acknowledged the transmission and opened his door, the interior lights of the patrol car temporarily destroying his night vision and forcing him to pause for a moment to allow his eyes to readjust to the darkness before approaching the Altima. The humidity hit him like a physical force as he stepped out of his air-conditioned vehicle, the night air thick with moisture and carrying the distinctive smell of the Everglades, a combination of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and the subtle musk of the countless creatures that inhabited the wetlands on both sides of the highway. The temperature was still in the low 80s despite the late hour, and Rollerson could feel sweat beginning to form under his ballistic vest before he had taken 3 steps toward the Altima. He approached the driver's side of the vehicle along the traditional path that kept him slightly behind the driver's sightline while providing good visibility into the interior of the car, his right hand resting casually near his service weapon without actually touching it, maintaining the balance between readiness and the appearance of routine professional interaction that was essential to effective traffic stops. As Rollerson drew closer to the Altima, his flashlight beam swept across the interior of the vehicle, and he began to register details that didn't fit the pattern of a simple lane violation stop involving a tired or slightly impaired driver. The rental car's interior was immaculate, showing none of the typical clutter of luggage, food wrappers, or personal items that would be expected in a vehicle being used by tourists or business travelers crossing the state. The back seat was completely empty and appeared to have been recently cleaned with professional attention to detail, and the driver sat with both hands visible on the steering wheel in the classic position that suggested either law enforcement training or extensive experience being stopped by police officers. The driver was a male in his 40s, dressed in dark clothing that appeared to be more suitable for urban environments than the casual beach attire typically worn by tourists traveling through Florida. His face was lean and angular, with sharp features that suggested intelligence and calculation rather than the relaxed demeanor of someone on vacation, or the exhausted appearance of a late-night commuter trying to reach home after a long workday. "Good morning, sir. I'm Trooper Rollerson with the Florida Highway Patrol. The reason I stopped you is I observed your vehicle weaving over the fog line several times in the past couple of miles. I need to see your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance, please," Rollerson stated, delivering the standard traffic stop introduction with the professional courtesy that was expected of Florida Highway Patrol officers regardless of the circumstances or the officer's suspicions about the true nature of the stop. The driver reached for his wallet with movements that were too controlled, too deliberate, lacking the natural flow that would be expected from someone simply retrieving documentation during a routine traffic encounter. Rollerson's instincts, honed by thousands of traffic stops and countless hours of training in recognizing pre-assault indicators and deceptive behavior, began sending warning signals that this stop might be evolving beyond the simple lane violation that had initiated the contact. "Of course, officer. I apologize for my driving. I've been on the road for several hours and I'm more tired than I realized. I should probably find a rest area and take a break before continuing," the driver said, his voice carrying an accent that Rollerson couldn't quite place, something that suggested European origins but without the distinctive characteristics of any specific country or region. The driver handed over a Florida driver's license that identified him as David Kellerman, age 43, with an address in Coral Gables that was located in one of Miami's more affluent neighborhoods known for expensive homes and residents who typically didn't drive rental cars unless their personal vehicles were being serviced. The vehicle registration confirmed the car was indeed a rental from a major national company, rented 3 days earlier from their Fort Lauderdale airport location, with an expected return date that was still 5 days in the future. The insurance documentation appeared legitimate and current, showing coverage that met Florida's minimum requirements for operating a motor vehicle on public highways. Rollerson studied the license under his flashlight, noting that the photograph matched the driver's appearance, but something about the document felt wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The license appeared genuine, with all the proper security features including the holographic overlays and the raised lettering that were designed to prevent counterfeiting. But there was a quality to the document that suggested it might be too perfect, lacking the minor wear and tear that would be expected from a license that had been carried in someone's wallet for the several months since its issue date. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm going to have you wait here while I verify this information with our records. I'll be right back. Please keep your hands visible and remain in the vehicle," Rowlerson instructed, following the standard procedure while his instincts continued to signal that something about this stop wasn't adding up correctly despite the driver's apparent cooperation and the legitimate appearance of his documentation. As Rowlerson walked back to his patrol car, he maintained visual contact with the Altima through careful glances over his shoulder, watching for any signs that the driver might be attempting to conceal contraband, retrieve a weapon, or prepare to flee the scene by suddenly accelerating back onto the highway. The driver remained motionless in the prescribed position with both hands on the steering wheel, but there was something about his stillness that seemed calculated rather than natural, as if he was performing the role of a compliant traffic stop subject rather than actually being one. Rowlerson slid into his patrol car and immediately began running the license through the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles database, cross-referencing the name and license number with the National Crime Information Center systems that would reveal any outstanding warrants, previous criminal history, or other flags that might explain his growing sense that this traffic stop was about to become significantly more complicated than a simple lane violation citation. The database response came back within seconds, and what Rowlerson saw on his mobile data terminal made his pulse quicken despite his years of experience maintaining professional composure during unexpected developments. The license number was valid, and the name David Kellerman did appear in the Florida DHS-MV records, but when Rowlerson pulled up the associated photograph from the state's database, the image showed a man who bore only superficial resemblance to the driver currently sitting in the Altima on the shoulder of Alligator Alley. The database photograph showed someone with softer features, different ear structure, and a distinctive scar on the left cheek that was clearly visible in the official state documentation, but completely absent from the face of the man who had handed over the license just minutes earlier. Rowlerson had encountered false identification before during his career, ranging from teenagers using fake IDs to purchase alcohol to sophisticated criminals using stolen identities to avoid detection during traffic stops. But there was something particularly unsettling about this particular case of identity fraud, something that suggested more sinister motivations than simply avoiding a traffic citation or concealing a suspended license. Rowlerson keyed his radio again, this time using a tone that would alert dispatcher Sutterfield that the situation had evolved from routine to potentially problematic without broadcasting that information in ways that might be overheard by the subject if he was monitoring police frequencies with a scanner. Dispatch 47. Can you run a QH on this license for me? I'm seeing some discrepancies that I need to verify before I proceed with this contact. Rowlerson transmitted, using the 10 code that indicated he wanted a more thorough background check than the standard traffic stop verification, including wants and warrants from neighboring states and any intelligence bulletins that might be relevant to the situation he was encountering. Sutterfield's response came back within moments, her voice carrying a subtle change in tone that indicated she understood Rowlerson's message and was treating this as more than a routine traffic stop verification. Copy 47. I'm running that now. Also be advised I'm showing you've been code 6 for approximately 8 minutes. Do you need additional units en route to your location? The question was Sutterfield's way of offering backup without explicitly stating that she was concerned about Rowlerson's safety, maintaining the professional communication protocols while ensuring that he had the opportunity to request assistance if the situation was deteriorating beyond his ability to manage it alone. Rowlerson considered the offer carefully, weighing his tactical situation and the potential consequences of either requesting backup that might take 20 minutes or more to arrive on this isolated stretch of highway or continuing the stop alone with a subject who was using fraudulent identification for purposes that remained unclear and potentially dangerous. Negative on additional units at this time, but keep me marked out and I'll advise if the situation changes. I'm going to make contact again and see if I can determine what's going on here before we escalate further," Rowlerson replied, deciding that approaching the driver with questions about the license discrepancy might reveal information that would help him understand whether he was dealing with a relatively minor case of identity fraud or something significantly more serious that would require backup and possibly supervisor notification. Rowlerson opened his door again and began walking back toward the Altima, this time approaching with heightened awareness of his tactical position and the potential that this apparently cooperative traffic stop subject might actually pose a significant threat if confronted with evidence that his identity documents were fraudulent. His right hand moved slightly closer to his service weapon without actually assuming a ready position, maintaining the appearance of a routine follow-up contact while preparing for the possibility that the situation might deteriorate rapidly, depending on the driver's response to questions about his identity. As Rowlerson reached the driver's window for the second time, he noticed that the man's posture had changed subtly from the initial contact, his shoulders now slightly tensed, and his eyes showing a wariness that hadn't been present during their first interaction, suggesting that he had been watching Rowlerson's return approach and had recognized from the trooper's body language that something about the traffic stop had shifted from routine citation to more serious investigation. "Mr. Kellerman, I need to ask you some additional questions about this license because I'm seeing some information in our database that doesn't match what you've provided me," Rowlerson stated, deliberately using a neutral tone that conveyed official concern without suggesting that he had already concluded the license was fraudulent or that he was prepared to escalate the stop to arrest status. The driver's response was immediate and surprising, his entire demeanor shifting from cooperative compliance to something that resembled resignation mixed with calculation, as if he had been expecting this moment and had already developed a strategy for managing the confrontation that both men now understood was about to occur. "Officer, I can explain the discrepancy, but I need you to understand that this situation is more complicated than it appears, and there are circumstances surrounding my use of this identification that involve matters of personal safety and threats from individuals who have been pursuing me across multiple states," the driver said, launching into an explanation that seemed designed to simultaneously acknowledge the fraudulent nature of the license while creating a narrative that might justify its use and potentially generate sympathy or at least understanding from the trooper who had discovered the deception. Rowlerson listened to the explanation with professional skepticism, born from years of hearing creative stories designed to explain away criminal behavior and convince law enforcement officers to exercise discretion rather than enforcing the letter of the law. The driver's story involved alleged domestic violence, threats from a former business partner connected to organized crime, and a desperate need to assume a new identity while traveling across the country to reach family members who could provide safe shelter from unnamed pursuers who meant him harm. The narrative contained elements that might have been plausible if encountered in isolation, but the overall presentation felt rehearsed and calculated rather than genuine, as if the driver had prepared this explanation in advance and was now delivering it with the hope that it would be sufficient to avoid arrest and continued investigation into his true identity and purpose. "Sir, I understand what you're telling me, but what you're describing doesn't change the fact that you're operating a motor vehicle on a Florida highway using fraudulent identification, which is a criminal violation regardless of your motivations or circumstances," Rowlerson replied, maintaining professional courtesy while making clear that the explanation, whether true or fabricated, would not result in the driver being released with a warning or simple citation that would allow him to continue his journey without consequences. The driver's expression shifted again, this time showing frustration mixed with what appeared to be genuine concern about the implications of being detained on Alligator Alley in the middle of the night, with his true identity about to be discovered through more thorough investigation. "Officer, I'm asking you to exercise some discretion here. I'm not a threat to anyone. I'm simply trying to get to safety, and being detained right now puts me at significant risk from people who are monitoring law enforcement systems to track my movements," the driver continued, attempting a different approach that appealed to Rowlerson's humanity and potential sympathy for someone allegedly fleeing domestic violence or organized crime threats that might justify the use of false identification as a means of self-preservation. Rowlerson had encountered this type of manipulation before. The attempt to create personal connection and emotional investment that might cloud his professional judgment and lead him to make decisions based on sympathy rather than established law and procedure. But his training and experience had taught him that seemingly sympathetic stories were often cover narratives designed to conceal far more serious criminal activity that would only be discovered if the officer maintained objectivity and followed proper investigation protocols. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, sir, and I want you to keep your hands visible at all times while you're doing that. We're going to sort out your identity situation before any decisions are made about how to proceed," Rowlerson instructed, moving the traffic stop to the next level of investigation that would involve more thorough questioning and potentially a search of the vehicle if the driver's behavior or additional information provided probable cause to believe the Altima contained evidence of criminal activity beyond the fraudulent license. The driver complied with the instruction, but his movements were slow and deliberate, suggesting reluctance to leave the relative safety of his vehicle and expose himself to extended detention on the highway shoulder, where, if his story about pursuers was genuine, he would be vulnerable to observation and potential attack from anyone monitoring law enforcement activities. Rowlerson maintained safe distance while directing the driver to position himself between the Altima and the patrol car, a location that provided some cover from passing traffic while allowing the trooper to maintain control of the situation and observe the driver for any signs of aggression or attempts to flee into the darkness of the Everglades that surrounded them on both sides. "I need you to be completely honest with me right now. What is your actual name, and why are you using someone else's license to operate this vehicle?" Rowlerson asked directly, abandoning the indirect questioning approach in favor of confrontation that would force the driver to either continue his deception or acknowledge his fraud and potentially provide information about his true identity and purposes. The driver hesitated for several seconds, his expression cycling through various emotions as he apparently calculated the potential consequences of different responses before finally seeming to reach a decision about how much truth to reveal in this moment of confrontation on one of Florida's most isolated highways. "My name is not David Kellerman, and the license I provided you is a sophisticated forgery that I purchased from someone who specializes in providing false identification to people who need to disappear from various databases and tracking systems," the driver admitted, his voice taking on a different quality now that he had abandoned at least some of the deception that had characterized their interaction up to this point. "That's a start, but I need your actual name and an explanation of why you felt it necessary to purchase false identification and operate under an assumed identity while driving across Florida in a rental car," Rowlerson pressed, understanding that the admission of using false identification was likely just the first layer of deception that would need to be peeled away before he could determine the true nature of the situation he had encountered during what had begun as a simple lane violation stop. The driver glanced toward the darkness beyond the highway shoulder, as if considering whether to attempt escape into the Everglades, despite the obvious dangers posed by the terrain, the wildlife, and the certainty that he would be quickly tracked down by units that would be called to assist in apprehending a fleeing suspect on foot in an environment where survival without proper equipment and knowledge would be measured in hours rather than days. "I can't tell you my real name, not here, not with the possibility that this conversation is being recorded and might be accessed by people who are looking for me," the driver said, introducing a new element of complication into the already complex situation by suggesting that routine police procedures like dashcam recording represented a threat to his safety that justified continued deception about his identity. Rollerson felt his patience beginning to thin, his professional courtesy being tested by a situation that was consuming far more time and generating far more questions than a routine traffic stop should reasonably produce, while still failing to provide clear answers about who he was actually dealing with or what criminal activities might be concealed beneath the layers of deception and manipulation. "Sir, I'm going to be very clear with you now. You're being detained for using fraudulent identification, and you're going to be transported to the Collier County Jail, where your true identity will be determined through fingerprinting and whatever other investigative means are necessary," Rowlerson stated, making the formal decision to arrest the driver and remove him from the highway to a controlled environment where more thorough investigation could be conducted without the tactical disadvantages and safety concerns inherent in conducting extended interrogations on the shoulder of Alligator Alley in the middle of the night. The driver's reaction to the announcement of arrest was not the anger or resistance that Rollerson might have expected, but rather what appeared to be genuine fear mixed with resignation, as if the prospect of being taken into custody represented something far more serious than the inconvenience and embarrassment typically associated with arrest for relatively minor offenses. "Officer, I need you to understand something before you take me into custody. There are people monitoring arrest records and detention facilities, and once my fingerprints enter the system, my location will be compromised within hours, possibly minutes, depending on how sophisticated their monitoring capabilities are," the driver said, making one final attempt to convince Rowlerson that his arrest would trigger consequences that extended beyond the normal processing of a criminal suspect caught using false identification. Rowlerson had heard similar warnings before from suspects who claimed that their arrest would endanger them or others. The standard manipulation technique of creating a sense that the officer bore responsibility for whatever negative consequences might follow from simply doing his job and enforcing the law without regard for the creative narratives suspects developed to avoid accountability. "Sir, I've listened to your explanations, but my responsibility is to enforce Florida law, and right now you're in violation of several statutes related to false identification and fraud. So whatever concerns you have about being taken into custody will need to be addressed with the judicial system, not with me on the side of the highway," Rollerson replied, ending the negotiation phase of the encounter and moving forward with the arrest procedure that would remove the driver from the Altima and place him in the patrol car for transport to the Collier County Detention Facility. As Rollerson moved to handcuff the driver, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision, a flash of headlights from a vehicle that had pulled onto the shoulder approximately 200 yards behind his patrol car, positioning itself in a way that suggested either someone stopping to offer assistance or, more troubling given the circumstances of this traffic stop, someone who had been following the Altima and was now observing the arrest with interest that might not be benign or coincidental. The driver noticed Rollerson's distraction and turned to look at the vehicle behind them, his expression shifting to what appeared to be genuine fear as he saw the car that had stopped in a position that provided observation of the traffic stop while remaining at sufficient distance to avoid clear identification or direct confrontation. "That's them. They've been following me since I left Fort Lauderdale, and now they know I've been stopped, and they're going to wait until you leave with me in custody before they search the rental car for what they think I'm transporting," the driver said, urgently, his voice carrying a quality of fear that seemed more genuine than the calculated performances he had been delivering throughout the traffic stop. Rowlerson's tactical situation had suddenly become significantly more complicated, with an unknown vehicle occupying a position behind his location that could represent either innocent motorists who had stopped to ensure the traffic stop was legitimate and the trooper was safe, or potentially dangerous individuals who were involved in whatever criminal activities had brought the driver of the Altima to his attention on this isolated stretch of Alligator Alley. "Get in the patrol car. Back seat, now," Rowlerson ordered, abandoning the careful handcuffing procedure in favor of getting the driver secured in his vehicle before dealing with the new arrivals who might pose a threat to the integrity of the traffic stop or the safety of both the trooper and his prisoner. The driver complied quickly, seemingly eager to be inside the patrol car and away from the observation of whoever was in the vehicle that had stopped behind them, his earlier reluctance to be taken into custody apparently overcome by whatever threat he believed was represented by the new arrivals to this increasingly complicated situation. Once the driver was secured in the back seat of the patrol car with the doors locked and the partition separating him from access to Rowlerson's equipment and weapons, the trooper turned his attention to the vehicle behind them, using his spotlight to illuminate the car and see if he could identify the occupants or determine their intentions in stopping at this particular location. The spotlight beam revealed a dark-colored sedan, possibly a Dodge Charger or similar performance vehicle, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see how many occupants were inside or what they might be doing while observing Rowlerson's traffic stop from their position 200 yards back along the shoulder. The sedan's headlights remained on, and the engine was clearly running based on the visible exhaust vapor in the humid air, suggesting that the occupants were not simply good Samaritans who had stopped to check on a traffic stop, but rather people who had intentionally positioned themselves to observe while maintaining the capability for rapid departure if circumstances required it. Rowlerson keyed his radio to update dispatcher Sutterfield on the evolving situation. Recognizing that his traffic stop had transformed from a routine lane violation into something that might require backup units and supervisor notification given the fraudulent identification, the driver's claims about being pursued by dangerous individuals, and the suspicious vehicle that had now taken up an observation position behind his location. Dispatch 47. Be advised my traffic stop has evolved into a 1015. Subject is using fraudulent identification and claiming he's being pursued by individuals in a dark sedan that is currently stopped approximately 200 yards behind my position. I need you to expedite at least one backup unit to my location and advise District Sergeant of the situation. Rowlerson transmitted, using the code that indicated he had a subject in custody while also requesting assistance with the tactical complications that had developed during what should have been a straightforward traffic enforcement action. Sutterfield's response carried a note of concern that suggested she understood the implications of Rowlerson's situation. Isolated on Alligator Alley, with a prisoner in his vehicle and unknown subjects positioned behind him in ways that could represent either surveillance or preparation for some type of intervention. Copy. 47. I'm dispatching Unit 23 from their current location at mile marker 41, ETA to your location approximately 12 minutes. I'm also notifying District Sergeant Halford of your situation and requesting he monitor this channel for updates, Sutterfield replied, her voice carrying the professional efficiency that came from years of coordinating law enforcement responses in situations that could deteriorate rapidly if proper resources weren't deployed with appropriate urgency. 12 minutes represented an eternity in tactical terms, long enough for the situation to evolve in countless directions before backup arrived to assist with managing the prisoner, investigating the suspicious vehicle, and determining what criminal activities had brought all these parties together on this isolated stretch of Everglades Highway in the hours before dawn. Rowlerson watched the dark sedan through his rearview mirror, looking for any signs that the occupants were preparing to approach his position or take other actions that might escalate the confrontation. But the vehicle remained stationary with its headlights continuing to illuminate the rear of Rowlerson's patrol car in ways that destroyed his night vision and made it impossible to see what the sedan's occupants might be doing while they observed his traffic stop. The prisoner in Rowlerson's back seat had begun speaking again, his voice carrying through the partition with urgency that suggested he believed the presence of the dark sedan represented imminent danger that required immediate action rather than the patient approach of waiting for backup units to arrive before investigating the situation further. Officer, You need to leave this location immediately. Those people in that car are not going to wait for your backup to arrive before they take action. They've been tracking me for 3 days, and they know this is their opportunity to recover what they think I took from their organization," the prisoner said. His previous calculated presentations replaced by what sounded like genuine fear and desperation, born from understanding that the tactical situation on Alligator Alley had shifted in ways that put everyone present at risk of violence. Rowlerson ignored the prisoner's suggestions about abandoning his position before backup arrived, his training and experience telling him that leaving the scene would only create new tactical problems, while potentially compromising the evidence in the Altima and failing to investigate what might be serious criminal activity, rather than the paranoid fantasies of someone trying to avoid prosecution for using false identification. "I need you to be quiet now and let me handle this situation according to proper procedure. We're going to wait for backup to arrive, and then we're going to sort out exactly what's happening here," Rowlerson said firmly, making clear that he would not be manipulated into taking actions that contradicted his training and the protocols that had been developed specifically to handle complex traffic stops that involved multiple unknown parties and unclear criminal activities. The prisoner fell silent, but Rowlerson could see through his rearview mirror that the man was watching the dark sedan with intense focus, his body language suggesting that he expected the situation to deteriorate at any moment, despite Rowlerson's attempts to maintain control through standard law enforcement procedures and tactical positioning. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness, each one feeling like an hour, as Rowlerson maintained his position between the Altima and the dark sedan, watching for any signs of movement or preparation for confrontation, while waiting for backup units to arrive and provide the additional resources needed to investigate this increasingly complex situation safely and thoroughly. At the 8-minute mark, the dark sedan's headlights suddenly went dark, and the vehicle began moving forward along the shoulder, approaching Rowlerson's position at a slow, deliberate pace that suggested calculation rather than the casual approach of someone simply checking to see if assistance was needed at a traffic stop. Rowlerson's right hand moved to his service weapon, unsnapping the retention holster and assuming a ready position that would allow him to draw and engage if the approaching vehicle's occupants demonstrated hostile intent that required defensive action. The prisoner in the back seat had begun speaking again, his voice pitched higher with fear and urgency as he watched the sedan approach. "They're coming. You need to call for emergency backup right now. These people will kill both of us to recover what they think is in that rental car," the prisoner said, his earlier attempts at manipulation replaced by what sounded like genuine terror, as the tactical situation evolved in ways that apparently confirmed his warnings about being pursued by dangerous individuals. "Dispatch 47, the suspicious vehicle is now approaching my position. I need that backup expedited, and you need to advise them we may have a hostile situation developing here," Rowlerson transmitted, his voice remaining professionally calm despite the surge of adrenaline that came with facing unknown threats in an isolated environment where help was still minutes away. Sutterfield's response came back immediately, her voice carrying the controlled urgency that indicated she understood the severity of Rowlerson's situation and was taking steps to deploy additional resources beyond the single backup unit that had initially been dispatched. "Copy. 47, Unit 23 is Code 3 to your location. ETA now 7 minutes. I'm also dispatching additional units from Broward County, and I have District Sergeant Halford monitoring your situation. If you need me to patch you directly to him, I can do that immediately." Before Rowlerson could respond to Sutterfield's offer, the dark sedan came to a stop approximately 50 feet behind his patrol car, close enough now for his spotlight to reveal details that had been invisible at the previous distance. The vehicle was indeed a Dodge Charger, relatively new, with heavily tinted windows and what appeared to be aftermarket modifications that suggested either law enforcement connections or criminal sophistication that went beyond typical vehicle choices. The sedan's doors remained closed, and the engine continued running, creating a standoff situation where neither party was willing to make the first move toward direct confrontation, but both sides were clearly evaluating their options and calculating the potential consequences of various courses of action. Raulerson made a tactical decision, choosing to maintain his position inside his patrol car where he had protection from the vehicle's ballistic-resistant doors and better visual coverage of both the Altima in front of him and the Charger behind, rather than exposing himself by approaching the sedan to investigate its occupants and their intentions. Dispatch 47. The suspicious vehicle is now Code 6 approximately 50 feet behind my position. No occupants visible. I'm maintaining my position inside my vehicle and waiting for backup arrival before making any moves to investigate or contact. Raulerson transmitted, documenting his tactical decisions for the record while ensuring that Sutterfield and potentially District Sergeant Halford understood his reasoning for not taking more aggressive investigative action. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, but according to Raulerson's dashboard clock, was actually only 90 seconds before the Charger's driver's door finally opened, and a figure emerged into the illumination of Raulerson's spotlight. The individual was male, appearing to be in his 30s, wearing dark, tactical-style clothing that could have been interpreted as either security contractor gear or the type of outfit favored by criminals who wanted to project an image of professionalism and capability during their illegal activities. The man raised both hands to show they were empty, but his body language suggested confidence and tactical awareness rather than the nervousness or uncertainty that would be expected from someone who was simply checking on a traffic stop and wanted to assure the trooper of peaceful intentions. The man began walking slowly toward Raulerson's patrol car, his hands remaining visible but his overall posture suggesting military or law enforcement training that had taught him how to approach potentially hostile situations while projecting non-threatening intent without actually surrendering tactical advantage or capability for rapid violence if circumstances required it. Raulerson keyed his radio before the approaching figure had closed half the distance to his patrol car, maintaining communication with dispatcher Sutterfield while documenting the evolving tactical situation in ways that would provide a clear record of his decisions and the circumstances that had led to whatever was about to unfold on this isolated stretch of Alligator Alley. Dispatch 47, one male subject exiting the suspicious vehicle and approaching my position on foot, appears to be wearing tactical clothing. Hands are visible, but I'm unable to determine if he's armed. I'm remaining in my vehicle until I can assess his intentions and backup arrives. Raulerson transmitted, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the uncertainty inherent in facing an unknown subject who was approaching his location with confidence that suggested either legitimate authority or dangerous criminal intent that couldn't be distinguished without further interaction. The prisoner in Raulerson's back seat had become agitated, pressing himself against the partition and speaking rapidly in a voice that carried genuine fear rather than the calculated performances that had characterized his earlier attempts to manipulate the traffic stop outcome. "Officer, you cannot let that man reach your vehicle. He's not going to identify himself or explain why he's been following me. He's going to create some pretense for approaching, and then he's going to try to take control of this situation through intimidation or force," the prisoner said urgently, his warnings becoming more specific and detailed in ways that suggested either genuine knowledge of the approaching man's capabilities and intentions or sophisticated manipulation, designed to convince Raulerson to take aggressive action that might complicate the situation further. Raulerson made a split-second decision based on his tactical training and the reality that allowing an unknown subject to approach within contact distance of his vehicle would surrender initiative and potentially create a hostage situation if the man's intentions were hostile. "Stop right there, sir," I need you to identify yourself and explain why you've stopped at this location before we go any further with this conversation. Rowlerson called out through his patrol car's public address system, his amplified voice carrying across the humid night air and establishing a safe perimeter that would allow him to assess the approaching man's response and intentions before permitting closer contact. The man stopped immediately at the sound of Rowlerson's command, his compliance suggesting either respect for law enforcement authority or tactical calculation that recognized the disadvantages of forcing confrontation with an armed trooper who had already demonstrated caution and professional awareness of the potential dangers inherent in the situation. The man lowered his hand slowly, reaching toward his waistband in movements that made Rowlerson's hand tighten on his service weapon before the man produced what appeared to be credentials in a leather wallet that he held up for inspection, despite the distance and lighting conditions making it impossible for Rowlerson to read any details from inside his patrol car. "Trooper, my name is Marcus Vance. I'm a private investigator licensed in Florida and working on behalf of clients who have a substantial financial interest in locating the individual you currently have in custody," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance separating them and projecting confidence mixed with professional courtesy that suggested he understood law enforcement procedures and expected his credentials and explanation to be sufficient for establishing legitimacy and cooperation. Rowlerson remained in his vehicle, processing this new information and comparing it against the prisoner's warnings about dangerous pursuers while calculating whether accepting the man's claimed identity at face value represented reasonable cooperation with what might be legitimate private investigation activities or dangerous naivety that could lead to losing control of an already complex situation. "Sir, I need you to remain where you are while I verify your credentials and determine what legitimate interest you might have in my traffic stop. You're going to toss that wallet toward my vehicle and then back away to your car while I examine it," Rowlerson instructed through the PA system, maintaining tactical control while providing a method for the private investigator to demonstrate his claimed legitimacy without requiring Rowlerson to leave the protected position inside his patrol car. The man who identified himself as Vance complied with the instruction, tossing his credential wallet in an arc that landed approximately 15 feet from Rowlerson's driver's door, before backing away with hands raised to demonstrate continued compliance and non-threatening intent. Rowlerson waited until Vance had retreated to his Dodge Charger before opening his door and quickly retrieving the wallet, spending minimal time exposed outside his vehicle before returning to the protected position where he could examine the credentials while maintaining visual observation of both Vance and the prisoner. The wallet contained a Florida private investigator's license issued to Marcus Vance with a photograph that matched the man standing beside the Charger, along with business cards indicating Vance operated a private investigation firm based in Miami that specialized in skip tracing, asset recovery, and corporate security services that would be consistent with his claimed interest in locating someone who had allegedly taken something of value from his clients. The credentials appeared legitimate with proper state seals and security features that would be difficult to counterfeit convincingly, but Rowlerson's training had taught him that sophisticated criminals often possessed authentic-looking documentation that could pass casual inspection without revealing fraudulent origins or criminal intent. Rowlerson radioed dispatch to verify the private investigator's license while maintaining observation of Vance, who remained beside his Charger in a posture that suggested patient waiting rather than preparation for aggressive action if his credentials failed to check out as legitimate. "Dispatch 47. I need you to run a verification on a Florida private investigator's license. Name, Marcus Vance. License number PIA 17-042389. I need to know if this is valid and if there are any complaints or violations on file before I proceed with this contact," Rowlerson transmitted, using the specific license number from the credentials to allow Sutterfield to conduct thorough verification that would reveal whether Vance was indeed a licensed investigator or someone using sophisticated false documentation to conceal different intentions. Sutterfield's response came back within 2 minutes, her voice carrying information that partially confirmed Vance's claimed identity, while raising new questions about the situation developing on Alligator Alley. 47. That PI license comes back valid. Issued to Marcus Vance with a Miami address. License is current with no complaints or disciplinary actions on file. However, I'm also showing that District Sergeant Halford is requesting direct radio contact with you regarding your situation. Do you want me to patch him through on this channel? The request for supervisor involvement suggested that Halford had been monitoring the developing situation and had concerns or instructions that required direct communication rather than being filtered through dispatcher relay. Rowlerson acknowledged Sutterfield's information and authorized the patch-through that would connect him directly with his district sergeant, while the tactical situation remained unresolved with a prisoner in his vehicle and a private investigator waiting for permission to approach and explain his interest in the traffic stop. Rowlerson, this is Sergeant Halford. I've been monitoring your traffic stop, and I need you to understand that the situation you've encountered is significantly more complicated than a simple false identification case. Halford's voice came through Rowlerson's radio with the tone of someone delivering information that would change the context and implications of everything that had occurred during the past 30 minutes on the Alligator Alley shoulder. Halford continued speaking before Rowlerson could respond to the cryptic warning about complexity beyond false identification charges. The subject you have in custody is actually named Raymond Burke. He's a federal witness who was relocated to Florida under the Witness Security Program after testifying against organized crime figures in New Jersey. And apparently he's violated the terms of his protection by engaging in activities that have attracted attention from both the people he testified against and private interests who believe he's stolen assets during his time in witness protection. The information from Sergeant Halford recontextualized everything that had occurred during the traffic stop, transforming what Rowlerson had interpreted as paranoid fabrications about pursuers and threats into potentially legitimate concerns about organized crime retaliation against a witness whose cooperation with federal prosecutors had apparently not ended his involvement in criminal activities. Rowlerson looked at the prisoner in his rearview mirror with new understanding of why the man had been using false identification and traveling across Florida in a rental car during the early morning hours, seeing not just a criminal attempting to avoid accountability, but a man caught between federal witness protection obligations and whatever activities had apparently violated the terms of his supervised relocation. Sergeant, what's my play here? Do I need to contact federal marshals about the witness security violation, or do I proceed with normal arrest procedures for the false identification? Rowlerson asked, seeking guidance on how to handle a situation that had suddenly expanded beyond state law enforcement jurisdiction into federal witness protection territory that involved protocols and agencies he had minimal experience navigating during his 11 years of highway patrol work. Halford's response provided clarity about Rowlerson's immediate responsibilities while acknowledging the larger jurisdictional complexities that would need to be addressed through channels beyond a district sergeant's authority. Right now, you proceed with arrest on the false ID charges and transport him to Collier County for processing. I'm making notifications to the U.S. Marshals Service about the witness security situation, and they'll coordinate with the jail for federal pickup. But your immediate concern is securing your scene and dealing with that private investigator who's apparently been tracking Burke on behalf of clients who may or may not have legitimate claims to whatever assets they believe he's taken, Halford explained, his instructions providing Rowlerson with clear direction, while acknowledging that the private investigator's presence represented additional complications that would require careful handling to avoid violating Burke's rights or interfering with whatever federal investigations might be ongoing. Rowlerson acknowledged Halford's instructions and requested clarification about how to handle Vance, who remained waiting beside his charger with apparent patience that suggested he understood law enforcement protocols and expected verification procedures before being allowed to participate in the developing situation. Regarding the PI, you can speak with him and determine what his client's interests are, but make it clear that Burke is in state custody on criminal charges and any civil matters or asset recovery issues will need to go through proper legal channels rather than being resolved through roadside negotiation. Halford instructed, establishing boundaries that would protect Burke's legal rights while acknowledging that Vance might have legitimate interests that deserved professional courtesy if they remained within lawful parameters. Rawlerson ended the radio contact with Halford and turned his attention back to Vance, using the PA system to authorize the private investigator to approach his vehicle for conversation about his client's interests while making clear that the prisoner would not be released or turned over to private custody regardless of what claims Vance might present about assets or obligations. "Mr. Vance, you can approach my vehicle now. I've verified your credentials and my supervisor has authorized me to speak with you about your client's interests. But I need to be clear that the subject in my custody is under arrest on state charges and will be transported to county jail, regardless of any civil matters you may want to discuss." Rawlerson called out through the PA system, establishing parameters that would allow productive conversation while protecting his prisoner and maintaining control of the arrest process. Vance approached Rawlerson's patrol car with confident strides that suggested relief at having his credentials verified and his legitimacy established, though his expression remained professionally neutral rather than displaying satisfaction or other emotions that might reveal his true assessment of the situation. When Vance reached Rawlerson's driver's window, the private investigator produced a business card and a document folder that he offered for inspection while beginning an explanation of his client's interests that would reveal another layer of complexity in the situation that had begun with a simple lane violation observation. "Trooper, I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation. My clients are a group of investors who provided significant capital to a business venture that Mr. Burke was involved in before he entered witness protection, and they have reason to believe he's currently in possession of cryptocurrency wallet access codes that represent their investment capital, which he's been attempting to liquidate and transfer to overseas accounts beyond their reach or legal recovery," Vance explained. His summary of the situation suggesting that Burke's violations of witness protection terms involved not just using false identification, but potentially sophisticated financial crimes that had attracted attention from private interests with substantial resources for tracking and recovery. The mention of cryptocurrency and offshore accounts added technological complexity to an already intricate situation involving federal witness protection, organized crime threats, and now civil asset recovery claims that existed in the legally ambiguous space where criminal and civil jurisdiction overlapped in ways that created complications for law enforcement officers trying to navigate their responsibilities. Rawlerson examined the documents Vance had provided, which included what appeared to be investment agreements, corporate records, and private investigator reports detailing Burke's movements and activities during his time in witness protection, suggesting that Vance's clients had been conducting extensive surveillance operations to track someone whose location should have been protected by federal authorities. "Mr. Vance, I understand your clients believe they have financial claims against my prisoner, but those are civil matters that will need to be pursued through proper legal channels. My immediate responsibility is transporting him on criminal charges and ensuring his safety while he's in my custody," Rawlerson stated, maintaining the boundaries that Sergeant Halford had established while acknowledging the legitimacy of Vance's investigation within the constraints of lawful private investigation activities. Vance nodded understanding, but pressed his case with arguments that suggested he had experience navigating the intersection of criminal and civil proceedings. "Trooper, I completely understand your position, but I need to make you aware that if Mr. Burke is processed through normal jail procedures, He'll have access to phone calls and potentially legal counsel that will allow him to transfer or conceal the cryptocurrency assets before my clients can obtain court orders for their recovery. I'm requesting that you consider the timing of his booking to allow for coordination with federal authorities who may want to secure his electronic devices and prevent asset transfers during the initial custody period," Vance argued, attempting to influence the timing and procedures of Burke's arrest processing in ways that would serve his client's financial interests while potentially compromising standard criminal justice procedures that protected defendants' rights regardless of civil claims against them. Rowlerson recognized the manipulation inherent in Vance's request, the attempt to use legitimate concerns about asset preservation to convince law enforcement to delay or modify standard procedures in ways that might benefit private interest at the expense of proper criminal justice administration. "Mr. Vance, I appreciate the information you've provided about your client's concerns, but the timing and procedures for booking my prisoner will be determined by standard protocols and any instructions I receive from my supervisors or federal authorities, not by private investigators representing civil claimants," Rowlerson replied firmly, ending the negotiation about special handling, while leaving open the possibility that federal authorities might indeed coordinate with Vance's clients about asset preservation through proper legal channels that didn't involve roadside negotiations or modifications to standard arrest procedures. Vance accepted Rowlerson's decision with professional grace, though his expression suggested disappointment that his arguments hadn't been more persuasive in obtaining the special consideration he had been seeking. "I understand, Trooper. I'll be following up through proper channels, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of the broader situation before Mr. Burke disappears into the federal system, where tracking and coordination becomes significantly more complicated," Vance said, making a final attempt to plant seeds of cooperation that might influence Rowlerson's future decisions about information sharing or coordination with private investigation efforts. Before Rowlerson could respond to Vance's parting comments, the sound of approaching sirens announced the arrival of backup units that had been dispatched when the situation first escalated beyond routine traffic stop parameters. The flashing emergency lights of an FHP patrol car appeared in the distance, approaching rapidly along the westbound lanes of I-75 with urgency that suggested the responding trooper had been monitoring radio traffic and understood the complexity of the situation requiring assistance. Rowlerson felt a measure of relief at the arrival of backup, knowing that additional law enforcement presence would improve the tactical situation while providing witness documentation of whatever happened next with both his prisoner and the private investigator who had tracked them to this location. The backup unit pulled in behind Vance's Charger, positioning itself to block any attempt by the private investigator to follow when Rowlerson eventually transported his prisoner to Collier County Jail, while also providing additional observation and protection during the final stages of the traffic stop that had consumed nearly 40 minutes of what should have been routine patrol activities. The responding trooper emerged from her patrol car and approached Rowlerson's position with the confident strides of someone who had been briefed on the situation through radio monitoring and understood her role in assisting with prisoner transport and scene documentation. Rowlerson recognized Trooper Sarah Kendrick, a 5-year veteran who had transferred to the Fort Myers district from the Tampa area and had developed a reputation for thorough documentation and professional handling of complex traffic stops that involved multiple parties and jurisdictional complications. "Rowlerson, I've been monitoring your radio traffic. Sounds like you've had an interesting night out here on the alley," Kendrick said as she reached his driver's window, her tone carrying professional curiosity mixed with the dark humor that law enforcement officers used to cope with the situations that tested their training and pushed their encounters beyond routine parameters into territory that would generate extensive reports and potential supervisor scrutiny. Rowlerson provided Kendrick with a brief summary of the situation, from the initial lane violation observation through the discovery of false identification, the prisoner's claims about organized crime pursuers, and the arrival of the private investigator who represented clients seeking asset recovery from a federal witness who had apparently violated protection program terms. Kendrick absorbed the information with the focus of someone cataloging details that would need to be included in supplemental reports supporting Rowlerson's arrest documentation. All right, so we've got a federal witness using fake ID, possible organized crime interest in his location, and a PI tracking him for civil asset recovery. This is definitely going to make for interesting paperwork, Kendrick observed, her summary capturing the essential complications while maintaining the professional detachment needed to handle the situation according to standard procedures, despite the unusual circumstances and multiple competing interests. Rowlerson asked Kendrick to maintain observation of both Vance and the rental Altima while he completed the arrest process and prepared Burke for transport to Collier County Jail, where federal marshals would apparently be coordinating pickup once they had been notified by Sergeant Halford about the witness protection violation. Kendrick positioned herself between the Altima and Vance's Charger, her presence establishing law enforcement control of the scene while allowing Rowlerson to focus on his prisoner without concern about the private investigator attempting unauthorized contact or interference with the arrest process. Rowlerson opened the rear door of his patrol car to speak directly with Burke, who had been watching the interaction with Vance and the arrival of backup with expressions that cycled between relief and renewed anxiety about his situation. Mr. Burke, I know who you are now, and I understand something about your situation with witness protection and the people who are looking for you. But right now my responsibility is transporting you on charges of using fraudulent identification, and you're going to be booked into Collier County Jail, where federal authorities will coordinate your custody, Rowlerson explained, using Burke's actual name for the first time and acknowledging awareness of the witness protection context while making clear that the immediate process would follow standard criminal justice procedures regardless of federal complications. Burke's response suggested he had been expecting this outcome since the moment his false identification had been discovered during the initial traffic stop. Trooper, I understand you're just doing your job, but you need to know that once I'm in the system and my location is documented, I've got maybe 48 hours before the people I testified against figure out where I am. Witness protection was supposed to keep me safe, but I violated the terms when I tried to recover assets that I earned legitimately before I ever cooperated with federal prosecutors. The admission provided context for Burke's activities and explained why he had been traveling across Florida using false identification and rental vehicles to avoid detection by both federal handlers and the organized crime figures who had reason to want him dead for cooperation that had apparently put significant criminal operations at risk. Rowlerson felt a measure of sympathy for Burke's situation, caught between federal obligations and personal financial interests in ways that had compromised his safety, while attempting to recover assets that may or may not have been legitimately earned before his cooperation with prosecutors. That's information you'll need to discuss with federal authorities and probably legal counsel, but right now we're going to complete this arrest process and get you to a secure facility where those conversations can happen without both of us standing on the shoulder of Alligator Alley in the middle of the night, Rowlerson said, maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging the complexity of Burke's situation without becoming emotionally invested in outcomes that were beyond a state trooper's authority or responsibility. Rowlerson helped Burke exit the patrol car and completed the handcuffing process that should have occurred earlier before the tactical situation with Vance's arrival had complicated the normal arrest sequence. With Burke secured and seated back in the patrol car for transport, Rowlerson turned his attention to the Altima, which would need to be searched and inventoried according to standard procedures for vehicles whose drivers were being arrested and transported to jail facilities. Kendrick assisted with the search, documenting the rental car's contents with photographs and written notes that would support the inventory report while protecting the Florida Highway Patrol from later claims about missing property or unauthorized searches beyond what was legally permitted during arrest situations. The search revealed a laptop computer, multiple cell phones, and a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be financial documents and handwritten notes about cryptocurrency transactions that supported Vance's claims about Burke attempting to access and transfer assets that his former business associates believed belonged to them rather than being Burke's personal property. The electronic devices represented potential evidence in multiple investigations spanning state, federal, and civil jurisdictions, requiring careful documentation and chain of custody procedures to ensure their admissibility if they became relevant to criminal prosecutions or civil asset recovery proceedings. Rowlerson photographed the devices in place before removing them from the vehicle, documenting their location and condition to establish proper evidence handling that would withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys, federal prosecutors, or civil litigators who might eventually claim interest in the contents. The laptop was password protected, showing a login screen that would require forensic examination to access without destroying data or triggering security protocols that might encrypt or delete files. The cell phones were similarly locked with passcode requirements that would need to be overcome through either cooperation from Burke or technical means that could extract data while maintaining evidentiary integrity for future legal proceedings. Rowlerson placed all electronic devices in evidence bags with proper sealing and documentation, understanding that these items represented the intersection of all the competing interests that had brought multiple parties to this isolated stretch of Alligator Alley in pursuit of information and assets that existed in digital form rather than physical locations that could be simply seized and secured through traditional law enforcement methods. With the vehicle search completed and evidence secured, Rowlerson coordinated with Kendrick about the Altima's disposition, deciding to have the rental car towed to an FHP impound facility rather than leaving it on the highway shoulder where it might be vulnerable to theft or unauthorized access by parties interested in its contents. Kendrick contacted a contracted towing service while Rowlerson completed his written notes about the traffic stop, documenting the sequence of events from initial lane violation observation through discovery of false identification, prisoner claims about pursuers, arrival of the private investigator, and eventual arrest and evidence seizure that had transformed a routine traffic enforcement action into a complex case involving multiple jurisdictions and competing interests. The paperwork would be extensive, requiring supplemental reports and coordination with supervisors who would need to understand the federal implications and ensure proper notifications were made to agencies that might have investigative or protective interests in Burke's custody and the evidence Hussein has seized from his vehicle. Vance approached Rowlerson again before the trooper could begin his transport to Collier County Jail, making a final attempt to establish cooperation, or at least information sharing that might serve his client's interests in tracking the cryptocurrency assets they claimed Burke had stolen. "Trooper, I know you've got procedures to follow, but I'm asking you to consider sharing information about those electronic devices with my clients through proper legal channels. They've invested significant resources in tracking Mr. Burke, and they have legitimate financial claims that could be compromised if those devices are held in evidence without anyone examining them for the asset information they contain," Vance argued, framing his request in terms of legal cooperation rather than the inappropriate information sharing that would violate evidence protocols and potentially compromise criminal investigations. Rowlerson understood the request but had no authority or inclination to commit to information sharing that would need to be approved by supervisors, prosecutors, and potentially federal authorities who might claim priority access to evidence relevant to witness protection violations or ongoing organized crime investigations. "Mr. Vance, any requests for information sharing or evidence examination will need to go through proper channels with FHP administration and the state attorney's office. I'm not authorized to make commitments about evidence access or information sharing beyond what's required by law and standard procedures," Rowlerson replied. maintaining the professional boundaries that protected evidence integrity, while acknowledging that Vance's clients might indeed have legitimate legal mechanisms for obtaining access to information relevant to their civil claims. Vance accepted the response with resignation, apparently understanding that further argument would not change Rollerson's position or authority regarding evidence handling and information sharing decisions. "I understand, Trooper. I'll be following up through proper channels. But I wanted to make sure you understood the broader context before Mr. Burke's situation disappears into the federal system, where coordination becomes exponentially more difficult," Vance said, making a final attempt to plant awareness that might influence Rollerson's future cooperation with legitimate information requests from private investigators representing civil claimants. With Vance's departure back to his charger, Rollerson prepared for the transport to Collier County Jail, checking his equipment and ensuring his patrol car was ready for the 40-minute drive that would remove him from his assigned patrol sector and consume additional time with booking procedures and evidence transfer that would extend his shift beyond the normal end time. Kendrick would remain at the scene until the tow truck arrived to impound the Altima, documenting the vehicle's removal and ensuring the shoulder was clear of debris or hazards before returning to her own patrol responsibilities in the Fort Myers district. Rollerson thanked Kendrick for her backup assistance and began the westbound drive toward the Collier County Jail facility, his prisoner silent in the back seat after the extended confrontation with multiple parties and the revelation that his attempt to disappear into anonymous travel across Florida had failed with the simple lane violation that had attracted law enforcement attention to his rental car and fraudulent identification. The drive to Collier County Jail took Rollerson past mile markers that he had patrolled thousands of times during his 11 years on Alligator Alley, familiar landmarks that seemed different now after the unusual traffic stop that had consumed most of his overnight shift and generated complications that would require extensive follow-up beyond the normal documentation and evidence submission that accompanied routine arrests. Rollerson thought about Burke's situation, a federal witness who had cooperated with prosecutors to dismantle organized crime operations, but had apparently been unable or unwilling to completely sever his connections to the financial activities that had provided his income before becoming a government cooperator, leading to witness protection violations and the attention of multiple parties with different interests in his location and the assets he controlled through encrypted digital means that represented the modern evolution of criminal finance beyond the cash and physical property that had dominated organized crime activities in previous generations. The intersection of witness protection, organized crime retaliation, cryptocurrency asset recovery, and routine traffic enforcement represented exactly the type of complex situation that challenged traditional law enforcement training and jurisdictional boundaries in ways that required coordination across multiple agencies and legal frameworks. Rollerson's radio crackled with Sergeant Halford's voice requesting status update on the transport and confirmation that the electronic evidence had been properly secured according to chain of custody protocols that would preserve its potential value for federal investigation. 47, this is Sergeant Halford. What's your status on transport and have you secured those electronic devices with proper evidence documentation? Halford asked, his question revealing that supervisory attention to this arrest extended beyond routine oversight into territory that involved coordination with federal agencies who had apparently expressed interest in Burke's custody and the devices seized from his rental vehicle. Rollerson confirmed he was en route to Collier County Jail with an estimated arrival time of 20 minutes, and that all electronic devices had been properly documented, photographed, and sealed in evidence bags with chain of custody forms that would track their handling through whatever investigations might eventually claim interest in their contents. Halford acknowledged the information and provided additional instructions that revealed the federal dimensions of the case were expanding beyond what Rollerson had initially understood when first learning about Burke's witness protection status. Copy that, 47. Be advised that U.S. Marshals are coordinating with the jail for immediate pickup after booking. They're also requesting that those electronic devices be held separately from normal evidence processing because FBI wants to examine them for information relevant to ongoing organized crime investigations that apparently extend beyond the original case that Burke testified about. Halford explained. His instructions indicating that Burke's activities during witness protection had attracted attention from multiple federal agencies who saw his devices as potential intelligence sources about criminal networks that had apparently continued evolving after his initial cooperation with prosecutors. The federal interest in immediate custody and evidence examination suggested that Burke's violations of witness protection terms had revealed information about ongoing criminal activities that prosecutors wanted to exploit through whatever cooperation they could extract from someone who had already demonstrated willingness to testify against organized crime figures when properly motivated by self-interest or legal pressure. Rowlerson acknowledged Halford's instructions and made mental notes about the special evidence handling requirements that would need to be communicated to jail staff during the booking process to ensure the electronic devices received appropriate security and documentation pending federal pickup. The situation had evolved far beyond the simple false identification arrest that Rowlerson's initial probable cause had supported, expanding into territory involving multiple federal agencies, organized crime investigations, cryptocurrency asset tracking, and witness protection program integrity that represented the complex reality of modern law enforcement, where simple traffic stops could reveal connections to sophisticated criminal enterprises operating across traditional jurisdictional boundaries. As Rowlerson approached the Collier County Jail facility, he reflected on the unpredictable nature of highway patrol work and the reality that routine enforcement actions could explode into complex cases requiring coordination across multiple agencies and legal frameworks that challenge traditional boundaries between traffic enforcement, criminal investigation, and federal jurisdiction. The jail's intake facility was quiet at this early morning hour, with minimal staff and few other arrestees being processed through the booking procedures that would transfer custody from Rowlerson to county corrections officers who would maintain security until federal marshals arrived to assume custody of their wayward witness. Rowlerson guided Burke through the initial intake procedures, maintaining security while allowing corrections staff to complete their documentation and photograph the prisoner according to standard protocols that would create permanent records of his booking on state charges for using fraudulent identification to operate a motor vehicle on Florida highways. During the booking process, Burke made several attempts to engage Rowlerson in conversation about his situation and the likelihood that federal authorities would honor whatever asset claims he believed he had against his former business associates. But Rowlerson maintained professional distance and declined to speculate about outcomes that were beyond his knowledge or authority to influence through opinions that might be misconstrued as official guidance or promises about how federal prosecutors might handle his case. The transfer of the electronic devices to special evidence handling created additional documentation requirements, as Rowlerson explained to the evidence technician that federal agencies had requested separate processing and enhanced security pending examination by FBI technical specialists who would be extracting data relevant to ongoing investigations. The evidence technician, a veteran corrections employee who had processed thousands of bookings and understood the complications that arose when federal interest intersected with state arrests, completed the special handling paperwork with practiced efficiency, while noting that Rowlerson would need to provide detailed testimony about the circumstances of seizure if the devices eventually became evidence in federal prosecutions that challenged the legality of the initial traffic stop and subsequent search. Rowlerson assured the technician that his dashcam footage and thorough written reports would document the entire sequence of events from initial lane violation observation through voluntary prisoner statements that had established a probable cause for arrest and the inventory search that had revealed the electronic devices in plain view during standard vehicle processing procedures. With the booking completed and custody transferred to county corrections, Rowlerson prepared to return to his patrol sector and complete the remaining hours of his overnight shift, before heading home to process the unusual events that had transformed a routine lane violation into a complex case involving federal witnesses, organized crime, and cryptocurrency asset recovery. As he walked toward his patrol car in the jail's parking lot, Rowlerson noticed a dark SUV with federal government plates pulling into a reserved space near the facility entrance. Its arrival suggesting that U.S. Marshals were already on scene to coordinate Burke's transfer from county custody to federal detention, pending whatever proceedings would address his witness protection violations and potential new cooperation, in exchange for continued protection from organized crime retaliation. The Marshals would have questions about Rowlerson's traffic stop and the circumstances that had led to discovering Burke's identity and location, requiring additional time and documentation beyond what he had already completed during the booking process at Collier County Jail. Rowlerson approached the federal vehicle as two marshals emerged, their professional attire and serious expression suggesting they understood the significance of Burke's arrest and the potential intelligence value of the prisoner and his electronic devices. The senior marshal introduced himself as Deputy Chief Marshal Raymond Tisdale and requested a detailed briefing about the traffic stop circumstances before they processed Burke's transfer to federal custody and began coordination with FBI agents who would be examining the seized devices for information about cryptocurrency transactions and potential organized crime connections. Rowlerson provided a comprehensive summary while standing in the jail parking lot, describing the initial lane violation observation, the discovery of fraudulent identification, Burke's claims about pursuers, the arrival of Private Investigator Vance, and the eventual arrest and evidence seizure that had produced the laptop and cell phones that federal agencies now considered priority intelligence targets. Tisdale listened with intensity, occasionally interrupting to ask specific questions about Burke's statements and behavior during the traffic stop. Information that would apparently inform federal decisions about how to handle their wayward witness, and whether his violations of protection program terms had irreparably compromised his safety, or merely created complications that could be managed through enhanced security and cooperation requirements. Trooper Rowlerson, I appreciate your professional handling of this situation. Burke's been a problem for us since about 6 months after his initial placement in witness protection. He's apparently been unable to separate himself from the financial activities that generated his income before he decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors, and his continued involvement with cryptocurrency accounts has attracted exactly the kind of attention that witness protection is designed to prevent. Tisdale explained, providing context that helped Rowlerson understand why Burke had been traveling with false identification and rental vehicles rather than the legitimate documents and coordinated movements that would be expected from someone properly complying with witness protection protocols. The marshal's comments suggested that Burke's witness protection experience had been characterized by tension between federal demands for complete severance from previous activities and Burke's own desires to maintain access to assets he considered legitimately his, despite their origins and activities connected to the organized crime figures he had testified against. Tisdale requested copies of all reports and dashcam footage from the traffic stop, explaining that federal prosecutors would need comprehensive documentation if Burke's arrest became relevant to either new criminal charges for witness protection violations or potential cooperation agreements that might exchange his testimony about ongoing organized crime activities for continued federal protection, despite his demonstrated inability to comply with program requirements. Rowlerson confirmed that all documentation would be provided through proper channels, with his supervisor coordinating federal requests to ensure appropriate information sharing while protecting Florida Highway Patrol's investigative prerogatives and evidence handling procedures. Tisdale thanked Rowlerson and headed into the jail to coordinate Burke's federal pickup, leaving the trooper alone in the parking lot with his thoughts about the complex case that had consumed his overnight shift and would generate extensive follow-up beyond his normal responsibilities for traffic enforcement on the isolated highways of Southwest Florida. As Rollerson drove back toward his patrol sector on Alligator Alley, he considered the interconnected web of interests that had converged on his routine traffic stop. State law enforcement pursuing traffic violations, federal authorities protecting and prosecuting witnesses, organized crime figures tracking someone who had betrayed their operations, private investigators recovering assets for civil claimants, and cryptocurrency technology that had created new forms of value and conflict that challenged traditional legal frameworks for defining and recovering property. The complexity represented exactly the type of case that modern law enforcement officers needed to navigate, despite training that often focused on traditional criminal activities and investigation methods that predated the digital age's transformation of criminal finance and communication. Rollerson knew his involvement in Burke's case was essentially finished beyond providing testimony if federal proceedings required his account of the traffic stop circumstances. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation remained unresolved and potentially dangerous in ways that extended beyond the immediate arrest and evidence seizure he had completed during his overnight shift. The sun was beginning to rise over the Everglades as Rollerson returned to his patrol sector, the humid darkness giving way to the harsh light that would transform Alligator Alley from the isolated and dangerous nighttime highway into the busy daytime corridor, carrying tourists and commerce across Florida's southern peninsula. Rollerson thought about Burke sitting in federal custody, likely negotiating new cooperation agreements that would exchange information about organized crime activities and cryptocurrency assets for continued protection from people who had every reason to want him dead for his previous testimony. The private investigator Vance would be filing reports with his clients about Burke's location and arrest, calculating whether the electronic devices seized by Florida Highway Patrol would yield information about cryptocurrency wallet access codes before federal authorities imposed security protocols that would prevent civil claimants from accessing evidence relevant to their asset recovery efforts. And somewhere in New Jersey or New York, organized crime figures who had been damaged by Burke's previous testimony would be receiving word that their target had been located and arrested on Alligator Alley, information that would inform their own calculations about whether attempting retaliation was worth the risks of confronting federal protection that might have been enhanced by Burke's latest violations and arrest. 3 days after the traffic stop that had introduced Trooper Rollerson to the complicated world of federal witness protection and cryptocurrency asset recovery, he received a phone call from Sergeant Halford requesting his presence at the Fort Myers District Headquarters for what was described as a debriefing session with federal agencies who had questions about the circumstances of Raymond Burke's arrest and the electronic evidence seized from the rental Altima. The summons wasn't unexpected, given the federal interest in Burke's case and the potential intelligence value of the devices that had been secured during the traffic stop. But Rollerson felt a measure of unease about meeting with federal agents whose investigative priorities and legal frameworks often differed significantly from the straightforward traffic enforcement that constituted his primary responsibilities as a highway patrol trooper. The debriefing was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, timing that would pull Rollerson away from his normal patrol duties during what should have been his preparation time for the overnight shift that had become his regular assignment during his 11 years working the Alligator Alley corridor between Naples and Fort Lauderdale. Rollerson arrived at district headquarters 15 minutes early, a habit developed through years of professional training that emphasized the importance of punctuality and preparation when dealing with supervisors or outside agencies whose assessments might influence career advancement or assignment decisions. The headquarters building was a modern facility that had been constructed during the previous decade's investment in law enforcement infrastructure, featuring secure parking, advanced communications equipment, and conference rooms designed for coordinating multi-agency operations that had become increasingly common as criminal activities evolved beyond local jurisdictions into complex networks requiring federal, state, and local cooperation. Sergeant Halford met Rollerson in the lobby, and escorted him to a second-floor conference room where 2 FBI agents and a federal prosecutor were already assembled, their professional attire and serious expressions suggesting that this debriefing represented more than routine follow-up about a traffic stop arrest. Halford made introductions that revealed the federal interest in Burke's case extended across multiple agencies with overlapping but distinct investigative priorities that would be competing for access to both the prisoner and the evidence seized during Rowlerson's traffic stop. Special Agent Michael Garrett from the FBI's Miami field office specialized in organized crime investigations that had been tracking the criminal networks Burke had testified against during his initial cooperation with federal prosecutors 3 years earlier. Garrett's presence suggested that Burke's arrest and the evidence seized from his vehicle represented potential intelligence about ongoing criminal activities that had continued evolving after the prosecutions that had sent several organized crime figures to federal prison based on Burke's testimony about money laundering, extortion, and interstate commerce violations. Special Agent Patricia Drummond from the FBI's Cybercrime Division represented the Bureau's interest in the cryptocurrency transactions that Burke had apparently been conducting in violation of witness protection terms, transactions that might reveal connections to international money laundering operations or other financial crimes that extended beyond the organized crime activities he had previously testified about. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Blackwell from the Southern District of Florida would be coordinating any new criminal charges against Burke for witness protection violations while also evaluating whether the evidence seized during the traffic stop could support prosecutions of other individuals involved in the financial activities that had attracted attention from both federal investigators and the private interests represented by the investigator Vance, who had tracked Burke to Alligator Alley. The assembled federal officials represented formidable investigative resources and legal authority that far exceeded anything Rowlerson typically encountered during his highway patrol duties, creating a dynamic where his role would be providing information and testimony about traffic stop circumstances rather than participating in the strategic decisions about how to exploit the evidence and intelligence opportunities was created by Burke's arrest. Sergeant Halford opened the meeting by summarizing the traffic stop sequence and noting that Rowlerson had conducted himself professionally throughout an encounter that had quickly escalated beyond routine parameters into territory involving federal witnesses, organized crime interests, and sophisticated electronic evidence that required specialized handling. Halford's summary established Rowlerson's credibility while acknowledging that the trooper had limited understanding of the broader criminal investigations that gave context to what he had encountered on Alligator Alley during his routine patrol activities. Special Agent Garrett took control of the meeting after Halford's introduction, launching into questions about the traffic stop circumstances with intensity that suggested his organized crime investigation considered Burke's arrest and evidence seizure as potentially breakthrough developments that might advance prosecutions that had been stalled by witness protection limitations on Burke's availability for ongoing cooperation. Trooper Rowlerson, I need to understand exactly what Raymond Burke said to you during the traffic stop about being pursued by individuals connected to organized crime, his exact words if possible, because those statements might establish state of mind and credibility issues that will be relevant if we attempt to use him as a witness in new prosecutions against individuals he claims are threatening his safety, Garrett explained, his question revealing that federal prosecutors viewed Burke's statements during the traffic stop as potential evidence that could either support or undermine his credibility if he testified about ongoing criminal activities in exchange for continued witness protection despite his program violations. Rowlerson retrieved his written report from the leather portfolio he had brought to the meeting and reviewed his detailed notes about Burke's statements, recognizing that his documentation would be scrutinized by defense attorneys if Burke's traffic stop arrest became relevant to future criminal prosecutions. The report captured Burke's initial claims about being followed by dangerous individuals monitoring law enforcement systems. his statements about threats from former business partners connected to organized crime, and his warnings that the dark charger represented pursuers who would attempt to recover assets he allegedly possessed. Raulerson read the relevant passages verbatim from his report, his documentation providing the exact language that Burke had used during the increasingly tense confrontation on Alligator Alley's shoulder. Garrett listened with focused attention, occasionally interrupting to request clarification about Burke's demeanor and emotional state when making particular statements, information that would help federal prosecutors assess whether his claims represented genuine fear of organized crime retaliation or calculated manipulation designed to generate sympathy and influence the traffic stop outcome. Special Agent Drummond followed with her own questions, focused on the electronic devices seized from Burke's rental vehicle, particularly interested in whether Raulerson had observed Burke attempting to access the laptop or cell phones during the traffic stop, actions that might indicate he was attempting to transfer or conceal cryptocurrency assets before they could be secured by law enforcement. Raulerson confirmed that Burke had remained in the patrol car's back seat throughout the extended traffic stop and had no opportunity to access the electronic devices after being detained on fraudulent identification charges, information that would support chain of custody documentation if the devices eventually yielded evidence about financial crimes or organized crime connections. The laptop and phones have been examined by our technical specialists, and they contain extensive documentation of cryptocurrency transactions involving accounts that we've been tracking in connection with international money laundering investigations that extend well beyond the organized crime activities Burke testified about 3 years ago, Drummond explained, her summary revealing that Burke's witness protection violations had inadvertently exposed criminal networks that federal investigators had been pursuing through separate investigations that might now converge because of the evidence seized during Raulerson's routine traffic stop. The cryptocurrency transactions documented on Burke's devices apparently involved accounts connected to Eastern European criminal organizations, South American drug cartels, and Asian organized crime groups that used digital currency to move illicit proceeds across international borders without the paper trails that traditional banking systems created for law enforcement tracking and interdiction efforts. Burke's involvement in these transactions raised questions about whether his witness protection violations represented independent criminal activities or coordination with the very organized crime networks he had supposedly betrayed through his cooperation with federal prosecutors, a possibility that would dramatically change how federal authorities evaluated his credibility and potential value as a cooperating witness in new prosecutions, Assistant U.S. Attorney Blackwell explained that federal prosecutors faced difficult decisions about whether to charge Burke with new crimes related to his witness protection violations and cryptocurrency activities, or attempt to leverage his knowledge of international money laundering networks in exchange for lenient treatment and continued protection from the organized crime figures who wanted him dead for his previous testimony. The prosecutorial decision would depend partly on assessments of Burke's credibility and willingness to provide truthful cooperation, factors that would be influenced by his behavior during the traffic stop, and his statements about threats and pursuers that might represent either genuine fear or sophisticated manipulation. Trooper Raulerson, based on your experience with thousands of traffic stops and encounters with people under stress, what was your assessment of Raymond Burke's truthfulness when he was making claims about being pursued by dangerous individuals? Did he strike you as genuinely fearful, or was he performing for effect to influence your handling of the arrest? Blackwell asked, seeking Raulerson's professional judgment about credibility issues that would be central to federal decisions about how to proceed with Burke's case. Raulerson considered the question carefully before responding, understanding that his assessment would carry weight with federal prosecutors despite his limited involvement in the broader criminal investigations that gave context to Burke's situation. His years of highway patrol experience had taught him to recognize authentic fear versus calculated performance, The subtle differences in body language, voice patterns, and behavioral consistency that distinguished genuine emotional responses from manipulative presentations designed to achieve specific outcomes during law enforcement encounters. My impression was that Mr. Burke's fear was genuine when the dark Charger arrived at my traffic stop location. His demeanor changed noticeably from the calculated explanations he had been providing about his use of false identification to something that appeared to be authentic terror when he saw that vehicle position itself behind my patrol car. Rowlerson replied, providing his professional assessment while acknowledging the limitations of judgments based on brief encounters under stressful conditions that might not reveal the full complexity of a subject's psychological state or motivations. Rowlerson continued his analysis by noting that Burke's subsequent behavior during the arrest and transport had been cooperative and resigned rather than displaying the continued fear that might be expected from someone genuinely believing his life was in imminent danger from organized crime pursuers. Garrett asked follow-up questions about the private investigator Vance and his interaction at the traffic stop scene, particularly interested in whether Vance had made any statements about his clients' identities or their connections to the organized crime networks that Burke had testified against. Rowlerson reviewed his notes about the conversation with Vance and confirmed that the private investigator had described his clients only as investors seeking asset recovery through civil litigation, without mentioning any organized crime connections or suggesting that his investigation was anything beyond legitimate skip tracing and asset location work for financial claimants. Garrett's interest in Vance suggested that federal investigators suspected the private investigator might be working for individuals or organizations connected to the very criminal networks that Burke's witness protection was designed to shield him from, raising the possibility that what appeared to be civil asset recovery efforts might actually represent organized crime attempts to locate and eliminate a witness who had damaged their operations through cooperation with federal prosecutors. The possibility that Vance's investigation had been funded by organized crime figures using civil litigation as cover for witness location and potential retaliation represented exactly the type of sophisticated criminal adaptation that challenged traditional law enforcement assumptions about clear boundaries between civil and criminal proceedings. Special Agent Drummond returned to questions about the electronic devices and whether Rowlerson had documented any attempts by Vance to photograph or otherwise record information about the laptop and cell phones during the traffic stop, actions that might indicate his investigation extended beyond simple witness location to intelligence gathering about the cryptocurrency assets and accounts that Burke controlled. Rowlerson confirmed that Vance had maintained distance from the Altima during the evidence search and had shown no obvious interest in photographing or recording the seizure process, though the darkness and tactical distractions of the traffic stop environment might have prevented Rowlerson from observing all of Vance's activities during the extended encounter on Alligator Alley's shoulder. The possibility that Vance had collected intelligence about the electronic evidence through surveillance equipment or techniques that weren't obvious during the nighttime traffic stop concerned the federal agents, who explained that organized crime groups had been adapting their intelligence gathering methods to exploit the very law enforcement procedures designed to protect evidence and maintain secure custody of materials relevant to ongoing investigations. Modern criminal organizations employed sophisticated surveillance technology and trained operatives who could collect valuable intelligence during what appeared to be routine interactions with law enforcement, using information gathered at arrest scenes to plan asset concealment strategies or witness intimidation campaigns that operated within legal boundaries while achieving criminal objectives. The debriefing continued for over 2 hours, as federal agents extracted every detail from Rowlerson's traffic stop experience that might be relevant to their multiple overlapping investigations involving witness protection integrity, organized crime prosecution, international money laundering, and cryptocurrency asset tracking. Rowlerson provided information about dashcam footage that had captured portions of the traffic stop, including Burke's demeanor during various stages of the encounter and Vance's arrival and positioning at the scene, though the camera angles and lighting conditions limited the footage's value for detailed behavioral analysis or comprehensive documentation of all activities during the extended nighttime encounter. The federal agents requested copies of all video evidence along with Rowlerson's written reports and any supplemental documentation he had created about the traffic stop, materials that would be incorporated into federal case files and potentially used in future criminal prosecutions or witness protection violation proceedings. Assistant U.S. Attorney Blackwell explained that Rowlerson should expect to be called as a witness if Burke's case proceeded to trial on either new criminal charges or violation of witness protection terms. Testimony that would require Rowlerson to explain the traffic stop circumstances and his observations of Burke's behavior and statements during the arrest process. As the debriefing concluded, Sergeant Halford took the opportunity to ask federal agents about the broader implications of Burke's case and whether the Florida Highway Patrol should expect additional attention from organized crime figures who might be tracking witness locations through monitoring of law enforcement arrest records and booking documentation. Garrett's response confirmed the sergeant's concerns and revealed that federal authorities considered Burke's arrest on Alligator Alley as a potential trigger for organized crime actions that could create risks for law enforcement officers involved in his custody or evidence handling. We know from electronic surveillance that the organized crime network Burke testified against has been actively searching for his location since he entered witness protection, and they've demonstrated sophisticated capabilities for monitoring law enforcement databases and communications to track individuals they consider threats to their operations, Garrett explained. His warning, suggesting that Rowlerson and other officers involved in Burke's arrest might themselves become targets for surveillance or intimidation if organized crime figures decided that eliminating or compromising law enforcement witnesses would advance their interests in undermining potential prosecutions. The possibility that routine traffic enforcement could expose officers to organized crime attention represented an evolving threat that challenged traditional assumptions about the boundaries between highway patrol duties and the dangerous criminal investigations, typically handled by specialized units with training and resources for managing threats from sophisticated criminal organizations. Halford pressed for specific security recommendations that would protect his troopers while allowing them to continue routine patrol duties without paranoia that would undermine their effectiveness in traffic enforcement and highway safety operations. Garrett acknowledged the tension between security concerns and operational effectiveness, recommending that troopers working Alligator Alley maintain enhanced awareness of surveillance indicators like vehicles that appeared repeatedly during patrol shifts or individuals who seemed to be photographing or recording routine law enforcement activities without obvious legitimate purposes. The recommendation stopped short of suggesting that troopers modify their normal patrol patterns or traffic stop procedures, but emphasized the importance of documenting and reporting any unusual encounters or surveillance indicators that might represent organized crime intelligence gathering about law enforcement personnel and their activities. Federal agents would be monitoring for threats against officers involved in Burke's arrest, but acknowledged that their protective resources were limited and that prevention depended largely on officer awareness and reporting of suspicious activities that might indicate targeting or surveillance by criminal organizations seeking revenge or intimidation leverage against the law enforcement system that threatened their operations. Rowlerson left the debriefing with mixed feelings about his role in a federal investigation that extended far beyond the simple traffic stop he had initiated when observing lane violations on Alligator Alley 3 nights earlier. His professional satisfaction at having conducted the arrest and evidence seizure according to proper procedures was tempered by concerns about potential organized crime interest in his identity and activities. Threats that seemed abstract and unlikely, but were being treated seriously by federal agents with experience tracking the capabilities and motivations of sophisticated criminal networks. The reality that routine highway patrol could expose officers to threats from international criminal organizations represented a significant evolution from the traffic enforcement and highway safety responsibilities that had defined most of Rollerson's 11-year career patrolling Florida's interstate system. As he drove back toward his patrol sector on Alligator Alley, Rollerson found himself paying more attention to vehicles that appeared repeatedly in his rearview mirror or seemed to be pacing his patrol car's movements. His awareness heightened by the federal warnings about organized crime surveillance, even as he recognized that most vehicles on the highway represented legitimate traffic with no connection to the criminal investigations consuming federal attention and resources. That evening's patrol shift passed without unusual incidents, but Rollerson couldn't shake the feeling that his traffic stop had set in motion consequences that extended beyond the arrest and evidence seizure into territory where his actions might have life or death implications for people he would never meet and investigations he would never fully understand. The thought that Raymond Burke might be negotiating new cooperation agreements based partly on intelligence derived from the electronic devices seized during the Alligator Alley traffic stop, gave Rollerson a sense of connection to federal prosecutions that might eventually dismantle international money laundering networks or organized crime operations spanning multiple countries and criminal enterprises. But that same connection created vulnerability that Rollerson had never previously experienced during his highway patrol career. The awareness that criminal organizations might view him as a threat worth monitoring or neutralizing if they concluded that his testimony or continued involvement in Burke's case represented obstacles to their operations or interests. The abstract threats discussed during the federal debriefing became more concrete when Rollerson noticed a dark sedan that seemed to appear repeatedly during his patrol shift. Maintaining distance but matching his movements along the Alligator Alley corridor in ways that suggested deliberate surveillance rather than coincidental travel patterns. Rollerson documented the suspicious vehicle in his shift log and attempted to close distance for license plate identification. But the sedan maintained its interval and eventually exited the highway at one of the few interchange points along Alligator Alley before Rollerson could obtain clear documentation that would allow follow-up investigation. The encounter might have been coincidental, but the timing so soon after the federal debriefing and warnings about organized crime surveillance created concern that Rollerson reported to Sergeant Halford during their end-of-shift communication. Halford took the report seriously and coordinated with federal agents to determine if the suspicious vehicle matched any known organized crime surveillance assets or represented innocent travel that Rollerson's heightened awareness had interpreted as threatening. The incident highlighted the psychological burden created by awareness of potential threats that might or might not be real. The challenge of maintaining normal operational effectiveness while remaining alert to surveillance indicators that could represent genuine criminal interest in law enforcement activities. Federal agents reviewing Rollerson's vehicle description and behavioral observations concluded that the sedan's movements were consistent with surveillance techniques used by professional investigators, but couldn't confirm whether the surveillance represented organized crime interest or some other investigation unrelated to Burke's case. The ambiguity was characteristic of counterintelligence challenges where threats existed in the realm of possibility rather than confirmed evidence, requiring vigilance without the paranoia that would undermine officer effectiveness and quality of life. Rollerson adapted his patrol routine to include counter-surveillance techniques he had learned during training but rarely employed during normal highway patrol operations, varying his routes and timing to complicate surveillance efforts while maintaining coverage of his assigned sector's traffic enforcement and safety responsibilities. The adaptations represented minor adjustments to his normal procedures, but they created psychological weight that affected his approach to routine encounters and his assessment of every vehicle that appeared repeatedly during his shifts. The transformation of Alligator Alley from familiar patrol territory into potential hostile environment where organized crime figures might be monitoring his activities represented exactly the type of threat evolution that modern law enforcement officers faced as criminal organizations became more sophisticated in their intelligence gathering and retaliation planning. Sergeant Halford recognized the psychological burden being imposed on Rowlerson and other officers involved in Burke's arrest. Coordinating with district administration to provide access to peer support resources and tactical training updates that would help them manage the security concerns without becoming dysfunctional in their primary duties. 2 weeks after the initial traffic stop, Rowlerson received notification that Raymond Burke had agreed to provide extensive cooperation about international money laundering networks in exchange for reinstatement in witness protection with enhanced security measures that would hopefully prevent future violations and maintain his safety from organized crime retaliation. The cooperation agreement meant that Rowlerson would likely be called to testify about the traffic stop circumstances in multiple federal proceedings as prosecutors built cases against individuals identified through Burke's information and the cryptocurrency transaction documentation extracted from the electronic devices seized on Alligator Alley. The prospect of repeated testimony in federal court represented significant time commitment beyond Rowlerson's normal patrol duties, creating administrative challenges for district scheduling while also exposing him to additional visibility that might increase rather than decrease his profile among organized crime figures tracking the investigation of their financial networks. Rowlerson understood that his professional duty required him to provide truthful testimony about his observations and actions during the traffic stop regardless of the personal inconvenience or potential security implications. But he couldn't help resenting the complexity that had resulted from what should have been a routine traffic enforcement action on an isolated highway during the quiet hours of overnight patrol. The resentment was tempered by satisfaction that his professional traffic stop had apparently contributed to federal investigations that might disrupt significant criminal enterprises, but the trade-off between professional accomplishment and personal security concerns created tension that Rowlerson struggled to resolve during the weeks following the federal debriefing and the suspicious surveillance incidents on Alligator Alley. Discussions with Sergeant Halford helped Rowlerson understand that modern law enforcement increasingly required officers to accept risks and complications that extended beyond traditional dangers of traffic stops and criminal apprehension. Embracing the reality that routine duties could expose officers to threats from sophisticated criminal organizations whose resources and capabilities rivaled those of legitimate law enforcement agencies. The philosophical acceptance of expanded risk profiles didn't eliminate Rowlerson's concerns about organized crime surveillance, but it provided context that helped him maintain professional effectiveness while remaining appropriately vigilant about potential threats that might develop from his involvement in Burke's case. Halford also shared intelligence from federal agents indicating that organized crime figures were indeed aware of Burke's arrest and cooperation, but were focusing their attention on the federal prosecutors and FBI agents directly involved in building cases, rather than peripheral witnesses like highway patrol officers whose testimony would be limited to traffic stop circumstances. The intelligence provided some reassurance, but Rowlerson recognized that criminal organizations' priorities could shift if they concluded that his testimony represented a critical link in prosecutions that threatened their leadership or operations. The uncertainty about future threat levels became a background concern that Rowlerson learned to manage without allowing it to dominate his consciousness or compromise his patrol effectiveness. His experience illustrated the hidden costs of modern law enforcement, where routine duties could trigger cascading consequences that affected officers' lives long after the initial encounters that had seemed straightforward during their execution. As weeks passed and no additional surveillance incidents occurred, Rowlerson gradually returned to normal patrol routines with only occasional awareness of the federal investigations that continued developing based partly on evidence he had seized during that routine traffic stop on Alligator Alley. The dashcam footage from the traffic stop was eventually provided to defense attorneys representing individuals charged in the money laundering prosecutions that resulted from Burke's cooperation, creating additional administrative burden as Rowlerson responded to discovery requests and prepared for potential cross-examination about his observations and procedures during the arrest. The legal proceedings consumed months of calendar time during which Rowlerson continued normal patrol duties while maintaining peripheral awareness of the federal cases developing from his traffic stop. His testimony was eventually required in 2 separate trials involving defendants charged with conspiracy to launder money through cryptocurrency accounts that Burke had accessed in violation of witness protection terms. Testimony that required Rowlerson to explain the traffic stop circumstances and confirm the authenticity of evidence seized from Burke's rental vehicle. The courtroom appearances were professional experiences that expanded Rowlerson's understanding of federal criminal justice procedures and the complexity of prosecuting financial crimes that involved international transactions and digital assets beyond traditional law enforcement expertise. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge the legality of the traffic stop and subsequent search, arguing that the lane violations Rowlerson had observed were insufficient probable cause for the extended detention and evidence seizure that had produced the cryptocurrency documentation. Rowlerson's detailed reports and dashcam footage supported the prosecution's position that all procedures had been conducted according to established legal standards, and the evidence was ultimately admitted despite defense challenges about the scope and duration of the traffic stop. The successful prosecutions that resulted partly from evidence seized during Rowlerson's traffic stop generated recognition from federal agencies and Florida Highway Patrol Administration, but the commendations felt hollow given the personal costs in time, stress, and lingering security concerns that had accompanied his involvement in cases that extended far beyond normal highway patrol responsibilities. Rowlerson declined media interviews about his role in the prosecutions, preferring to maintain low profile that would hopefully minimize any organized crime interest in his identity or activities. The decision to avoid publicity represented Rowlerson's attempt to manage security concerns through obscurity, though he recognized that his testimony in federal trials had already established his identity in court records that could be accessed by criminal organizations with sufficient resources and motivation. The reality that routine traffic enforcement could expose officers to international criminal attention represented a disturbing evolution in threat landscapes that challenged traditional assumptions about the relatively benign dangers of highway patrol compared to specialized units that directly confronted violent criminals or investigated complex conspiracies. Months after the initial traffic stop, Sergeant Halford informed Rowlerson that federal agents had dismantled the organized crime network that Burke had originally testified against, using information from the cooperative witness and the cryptocurrency records to build cases against international money laundering operations that had continued operating despite previous prosecutions. The successful investigation represented significant law enforcement achievement, but provided little practical benefit to Rowlerson beyond the abstract satisfaction of having contributed to justice through his professional execution of a routine traffic stop. His life returned to normal patrol rhythms on Alligator Alley, though he never again encountered the simple traffic violation without considering the potential for complex consequences that might extend far beyond the immediate enforcement action. The experience had fundamentally changed his approach to highway patrol, adding layers of awareness and caution that wouldn't have developed through normal career progression involving only routine traffic enforcement and highway safety operations. Rowlerson's story became known among Florida Highway Patrol officers as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of modern law enforcement and the reality that no encounter was truly routine once criminal sophistication reached levels that could exploit any law enforcement action for intelligence gathering or retaliation planning. 8 months after the traffic stop that had transformed Trooper Rowlerson's understanding of Highway Patrol's intersection with federal investigations and organized crime networks, he received an encrypted message through official Florida Highway Patrol channels requesting immediate contact with FBI Special Agent Garrett regarding developments in the cases that had originated from Raymond Burke's cooperation and the cryptocurrency evidence seized on Alligator Alley. The urgency suggested by the encrypted communication method and the request for immediate contact created immediate concern that something had gone wrong with the federal prosecutions, or that new threats had emerged requiring law enforcement coordination and protective measures. Rowlerson contacted Garrett through the secure phone line provided in the encrypted message, reaching the FBI agent at his Miami field office during what appeared to be late evening hours, based on the background noise and Garrett's fatigued tone, suggesting long workdays consumed by the complex international investigations that had developed from Burke's cooperation. Garrett's first words confirmed Rowlerson's concerns that something significant had changed in the security landscape surrounding the cases that had consumed so much federal attention and resources during the months following the Alligator Alley arrest. Trooper Rowlerson, we have a situation that requires your immediate awareness and potentially your participation in protective measures that extend beyond normal law enforcement protocols, Garrett began, his formal tone and careful word choices suggesting that the conversation was being recorded and that whatever information he was about to share carried legal and security implications that required precise documentation. Garrett continued without waiting for Rowlerson's response to the ominous introduction. Raymond Burke was killed 3 days ago in what appeared to be a random robbery at a convenience store in Tallahassee, where he had been relocated after completing his cooperation testimony. But our investigation has determined that his death was actually a targeted assassination conducted by individuals with connections to the organized crime networks he testified against. And we have intelligence suggesting that other individuals involved in his arrest and the subsequent prosecutions may also be targeted for retaliation. The news of Burke's death hit Rowlerson with unexpected emotional impact, despite his limited personal connection to the witness whose cooperation had generated the federal cases and all the complications that had followed from that routine traffic stop on Alligator Alley 8 months earlier. The revelation that Burke's death represented organized crime retaliation rather than random violence transformed the abstract security concerns that Rowlerson had been managing into concrete threats that required immediate protective responses and strategic decisions about how to maintain operational effectiveness while managing risks from sophisticated criminal organizations willing to commit murder to discourage future cooperation with law enforcement. Garrett explained that federal investigators had identified 3 individuals who had entered the United States using false documentation approximately 2 weeks before Burke's assassination, their movements and communications suggesting coordination with organized crime figures who had been damaged by the prosecutions resulting from Burke's testimony and the cryptocurrency evidence. The assassins had apparently been tracking multiple targets, including federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and peripheral witnesses whose testimony had supported the money laundering cases, creating a threat environment where anyone connected to the investigation might be at risk from retaliation operations that were still ongoing despite Burke's death. We're implementing protective measures for all federal personnel involved in the prosecutions, but we wanted to alert you to the potential threat and provide resources for enhancing your personal security during this period, while we work to identify and apprehend the individuals responsible for Burke's assassination, Garrett explained, his offer of federal protective resources creating new complications for Rowlerson's life and career that extended far beyond the time commitments and testimony requirements that had already resulted from his involvement in the case. Rowlerson's immediate response was to question whether the threat assessment justified the disruption to his normal life and patrol duties, a reaction that Garrett apparently anticipated based on his prepared response about the sophisticated capabilities and demonstrated willingness of organized crime networks to conduct retaliation operations against law enforcement personnel. Trooper, I understand your reluctance to accept protective measures that will disrupt your routine. But we need you to understand that the individuals who killed Burke have been surveilling multiple targets for weeks before conducting their operation, and your name appears in court documents and testimony transcripts that are accessible to anyone with basic research capabilities and motivation to identify everyone involved in the prosecutions, Garrett argued. His explanation making clear that Rollerson's visibility in federal court proceedings had created exactly the exposure that his earlier attempts to maintain low profile had been designed to prevent. The reality that court records had permanently documented his role in Burke's arrest, and the evidence seizure meant that any organized crime figure interested in intimidating or eliminating witnesses could easily identify Rollerson as someone whose continued health and willingness to testify might be relevant to their interests in disrupting or discouraging future prosecutions. The conversation with Garrett consumed over an hour, as the FBI agent detailed the specific threat indicators that had prompted the protective warnings and outlined the security measures that federal authorities recommended for law enforcement personnel connected to the prosecutions. The recommendations included enhanced awareness of surveillance indicators, modifications to daily routines to complicate tracking efforts, coordination with local law enforcement for increased patrol presence near residences, and consideration of temporary relocation until the assassination threats could be neutralized through apprehension of the individuals responsible for Burke's death. Rollerson listened to the recommendations with growing frustration at the extent to which a routine traffic stop had metastasized into threats that would require fundamental changes to his life and career, changes that seemed disproportionate to his relatively minor role in federal cases that had been built primarily on Burke's cooperation rather than the traffic stop circumstances that had initiated the investigation. Garrett acknowledged Rollerson's frustration, but emphasized that organized crime retaliation operations often targeted peripheral witnesses precisely because they lacked the robust security measures protecting primary investigators and prosecutors, making them vulnerable targets whose deaths could discourage future cooperation, while sending messages about the costs of testifying against criminal organizations. The unfortunate reality is that your visibility in court testimony and the accessibility of your identity through public records has made you a potential target regardless of how minor your actual role was in building the cases. And these organizations have demonstrated willingness to invest significant resources in operations designed to discourage future witnesses from cooperating with law enforcement, Garrett explained, his summary capturing the perverse logic of organized crime retaliation that could transform routine law enforcement duties into life-threatening exposure, simply through the normal functioning of transparent criminal justice systems that documented all participants in legal proceedings. Rollerson ended the call with Garrett after agreeing to implement enhanced security awareness and coordinate with Sergeant Halford about patrol modifications that would reduce his predictability while maintaining coverage of his assigned sector's traffic enforcement responsibilities. The weight of the conversation settled over Rollerson as he contemplated the possibility that his 11-year career in highway patrol had culminated in threats from international criminal organizations because of a lane violation observation that had seemed completely routine until the moment he discovered fraudulent identification, and began the sequence of events that had led to federal prosecutions and apparently provoked assassination operations by criminal networks, whose resources and reach extended far beyond anything he had previously encountered during his law enforcement career. That evening's patrol shift felt fundamentally different, as Rollerson maintained heightened awareness of every vehicle that appeared in his mirrors, or seemed to pace his movements along Alligator Alley, his professional vigilance now colored by personal security concerns that transformed routine traffic observation into potential threat assessment that consumed mental energy and created stress beyond the normal demands of highway patrol duties. Every traffic stop became an exercise in tactical positioning and threat evaluation that went beyond standard officer safety protocols, as Rowlerson considered whether approaching vehicles might contain organized crime operatives monitoring his activities or preparing for operations that would eliminate him as a potential witness in future prosecutions that might develop from ongoing federal investigations. The paranoia was exhausting, and Rowlerson recognized that maintaining this level of hypervigilance indefinitely would be unsustainable without either burning out emotionally or becoming so cautious that his patrol effectiveness would be compromised beyond acceptable operational standards. Sergeant Halford understood the psychological burden being imposed by the threat environment and arranged for Rowlerson to meet with peer support specialists who had experience helping law enforcement officers manage stress from threats that extended beyond traditional occupational dangers into territory where personal and professional lives became indistinguishable targets for sophisticated adversaries. The peer support sessions provided some relief through validation that Rowlerson's concerns were rational responses to legitimate threats, rather than paranoid overreactions to abstract possibilities. But they couldn't eliminate the fundamental reality that his involvement in federal prosecutions had created ongoing security vulnerabilities that would persist until either the organized crime networks were dismantled or their interest in retaliation operations was neutralized through other means. Weeks passed with Rowlerson maintaining modified patrol routines and enhanced security awareness, while federal investigators worked to identify and apprehend the individuals responsible for Burke's assassination and the broader retaliation campaign against witnesses in the money laundering prosecutions. The investigation eventually identified 2 suspects who were arrested at Miami International Airport attempting to leave the country after conducting surveillance operations against multiple targets, including federal prosecutors and FBI agents involved in the cases. The arrests provided some relief, but federal authorities acknowledged that the organized crime networks retained capability and motivation for continued retaliation operations using different operatives who might already be in the United States or who could be recruited from criminal associates with reasons to discourage future cooperation with law enforcement. The indefinite nature of the threat created ongoing burden that affected Rowlerson's quality of life and his approach to patrol duties in ways that suggested his career might need to evolve beyond highway patrol into assignments that provided lower visibility and reduced exposure to the types of complex cases that could generate federal attention and organized crime interest. Discussions with Sergeant Halford explored potential reassignment options that would allow Rowlerson to continue contributing to law enforcement while managing security concerns that had resulted from his professional execution of what should have been routine traffic enforcement actions. The reassignment options included training positions, administrative duties, or specialized units that operated with enhanced security protocols designed to protect officers whose work created exposure to threats from sophisticated criminal organizations. Rowlerson resisted the reassignment suggestions initially, viewing them as surrendering to criminal intimidation and abandoning the highway patrol duties that had defined his career and professional identity for over a decade. But the ongoing psychological burden of maintaining hypervigilance during every patrol shift eventually convinced him that some modification to his career trajectory was necessary for preserving both his effectiveness and his mental health. The decision to request reassignment felt like defeat, even as Rowlerson recognized it represented pragmatic adaptation to threat environments that had evolved beyond traditional law enforcement assumptions about the relatively contained risks of highway patrol, compared to more dangerous specializations like narcotics investigation or gang enforcement. His experience illustrated how modern criminal sophistication could transform any law enforcement duty into high-risk exposure through connections to federal investigations and international criminal networks, whose resources and capabilities rivaled those of legitimate government agencies. Rollerson's final weeks patrolling Alligator Alley carried bittersweet quality as he reflected on the thousands of traffic stops and highway safety interventions that had constituted his career before the encounter with Raymond Burke had transformed his professional trajectory and introduced complications that would affect the remainder of his law enforcement career, regardless of whatever new assignment he eventually accepted. The highway that had been his professional home for 11 years now felt contaminated by threats that had nothing to do with the traffic enforcement and public safety responsibilities that had motivated his original career choice and sustained his commitment through years of overnight shifts and routine patrols through some of Florida's most isolated territory. Sergeant Halford organized an informal gathering of district troopers to acknowledge Rowlerson's contributions to highway safety and his professional handling of the complex case that had resulted from his traffic stop. But the celebration felt hollow given the circumstances forcing his reassignment and the reality that his career was being disrupted by factors completely beyond his control or reasonable anticipation. His fellow troopers understood that Rowlerson's experience represented cautionary example about the unpredictable consequences of modern law enforcement, and the reality that no duty was truly routine once criminal sophistication reached levels that could exploit any enforcement action for intelligence gathering or retaliation planning. The informal gathering became opportunity for Rowlerson to share lessons learned from his experience, emphasizing the importance of thorough documentation and professional execution of all enforcement actions, regardless of how routine they appeared, since any traffic stop might unexpectedly connect to complex investigations with implications extending far beyond the immediate violation observation. His advice to maintain appropriate vigilance without surrendering to paranoia reflected his own struggle to balance security awareness with operational effectiveness during the months of heightened threat environment following Burke's assassination. Rowlerson's reassignment to a training position at the Florida Highway Patrol Academy removed him from patrol duties, but allowed him to continue contributing to law enforcement through instruction of new troopers about traffic stop procedures, evidence handling, and the complex legal environments that increasingly characterized modern highway patrol operations. The training position provided security through reduced public visibility, while allowing Rowlerson to share his experience in ways that might prevent other troopers from making mistakes or encountering complications similar to those that had resulted from his otherwise professional traffic stop on Alligator Alley. His lessons emphasized the intersection of routine traffic enforcement with federal jurisdiction, organized crime investigations, and technological evidence like cryptocurrency transactions that required specialized handling and created complications beyond traditional patrol training. The Academy instructors incorporated Rowlerson's case into curriculum as example of how professional execution of standard procedures could lead to unexpected involvement in complex investigations requiring coordination across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, transforming a simple traffic stop into federal court testimony and potential organized crime targeting that extended months or years beyond the initial enforcement action. The training position allowed Rowlerson to maintain law enforcement career while managing security concerns that had made continued patrol duties psychologically unsustainable, given the ongoing, although diminished threats from organized crime networks that retained motivation for discouraging future witness cooperation. Federal investigators eventually dismantled significant portions of the international money laundering networks that had been targeted through prosecutions built partly on evidence seized during Rowlerson's traffic stop. But the successful investigations provided little personal satisfaction, given the professional and personal costs that had accompanied his involvement in cases that had consumed his life for over a year following that routine traffic stop. His reflection on the experience highlighted the hidden costs of modern law enforcement, where sophisticated criminal organizations could transform routine duties into high-risk exposure through their sophisticated intelligence gathering and willingness to conduct retaliation operations against anyone who contributed to prosecutions that threatened their operations. The transformation of Alligator Alley from familiar patrol territory into the site of a traffic stop that had permanently altered his career trajectory remained source of frustration and regret, even as Rollerson recognized that his professional actions had been appropriate, and that the complications resulted from factors beyond any reasonable officer's ability to anticipate or prevent through alternative decisions during the traffic stop sequence. Years after the initial traffic stop, Rollerson occasionally drove Alligator Alley during off-duty hours, experiencing the highway as civilian traveler rather than patrol officer, and recognizing how different the environment felt without the professional responsibilities and threat awareness that had characterized his final months patrolling the isolated corridor through the Everglades. The highway continued carrying its endless stream of traffic between Florida's coasts, its function unchanged by the complex criminal investigations and assassination operations that had been triggered by one trooper's observation of lane violations during an overnight patrol shift. Mile marker 64, where Rollerson had initiated the traffic stop that changed his career, looked identical to every other mile marker along the featureless highway, offering no indication that this particular location had been the starting point for federal prosecutions, international criminal investigations, and retaliation operations that had affected dozens of lives across multiple countries and criminal organizations. The anonymity of the location seemed appropriate given the routine nature of the traffic stop that had occurred there. Another reminder that significant consequences could flow from apparently mundane enforcement actions when criminal sophistication and federal jurisdiction intersected with state highway patrol duties. Rollerson's story became known among Florida law enforcement as cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of modern policing and the reality that routine traffic stops could expose officers to threats and complications extending far beyond traditional occupational dangers. His experience influenced training programs and security protocols designed to help officers recognize when routine encounters might be connecting to larger criminal investigations requiring enhanced awareness and protective measures. The lessons learned from his case emphasized the importance of thorough documentation, professional execution of standard procedures, and coordination with federal authorities when traffic stops revealed evidence or suspects connected to investigations beyond local jurisdiction. But no amount of training could eliminate the fundamental uncertainty inherent in highway patrol, where every traffic stop represented potential gateway to complex investigations with unpredictable consequences for officers whose only intention was enforcing traffic laws and maintaining highway safety. The reality that professional competence could create, rather than prevent, career disruption and personal security threats represented disturbing evolution in law enforcement environments, where criminal sophistication increasingly challenged traditional assumptions about contained risks and predictable career trajectories. Dispatcher Ione Sutterfield, who had been monitoring radio traffic during Rollerson's traffic stop and the subsequent complications, retired from the Fort Myers Communications Center 2 years after the incident. Her decision influenced partly by stress from coordinating protective responses and threat notifications during the period when organized crime retaliation operations were targeting individuals connected to the federal prosecutions. Her retirement removed another experienced professional whose career had been affected by the cascading consequences of that routine traffic stop on Alligator Alley, illustrating how criminal sophistication could impose costs on multiple law enforcement personnel, whose only connection to complex investigations was their professional competence in executing standard duties during routine shifts. Sutterfield's replacement at the Communications Center received briefings about the case as part of training about how routine radio communications could suddenly escalate into federal coordination, requiring enhanced security protocols and awareness of threats extending beyond local criminal activities into international organized crime territory. The institutional knowledge preserved through training programs ensured that future dispatchers would understand the potential for routine traffic stops to generate complications requiring resources and responses beyond standard patrol support. Sergeant Creed Halford continued supervising the Fort Myers district with enhanced awareness of the security implications that could result from troopers' involvement in traffic stops connecting to federal investigations. His own experience managing Rowlerson's case informing his approach to similar situations that arose periodically as highway patrol inevitably intersected with complex criminal enterprises using Florida's interstate system for transportation and criminal activities. Halford developed protocols for early identification of traffic stops that might be connecting to federal jurisdiction, establishing communication channels with FBI and other federal agencies that would allow rapid coordination and protective measures when troopers encountered evidence or suspects relevant to ongoing investigations beyond state authority. The protocols represented lessons learned from Rowlerson's experience, attempting to provide earlier intervention and support that might prevent other troopers from experiencing the same career disruption and security threats that had forced reassignment and created ongoing psychological burden for someone who had simply executed professional traffic stop procedures during routine patrol duties. The dark sedan that Rowlerson had noticed during his heightened awareness period following federal threat warnings was never definitively identified as organized crime surveillance, despite investigative efforts to determine whether his concerns had represented genuine threats or products of heightened anxiety following Burke's assassination. The ambiguity remained characteristic of counterintelligence environments where threats existed in realm of possibility rather than confirmed evidence, requiring vigilance that imposed psychological costs regardless of whether specific incidents represented actual danger or innocent activities misinterpreted through lens of heightened awareness. Rowlerson's inability to ever know whether he had been genuinely targeted by organized crime operatives or had simply experienced normal traffic patterns through perspective distorted by threat warnings contributed to his decision that continued patrol duties would be psychologically unsustainable, given the impossibility of distinguishing real threats from innocent activities during routine shifts on Alligator Alley. The private investigator, Marcus Vance, whose appearance at the traffic stop had been early indication of the complex interests surrounding Raymond Burke, continued operating his Miami-based investigation firm with apparent success despite questions about whether his clients had included organized crime figures using civil asset recovery as cover for witness location operations. Federal investigators interviewed Vance multiple times about his role in tracking Burke and his potential connections to the organized crime networks that had eventually succeeded in assassinating the federal witness, but no charges were filed, and Vance maintained that his investigation had been legitimate skip tracing work for civil claimants with no knowledge of organized crime interests or assassination planning. The lack of prosecution didn't eliminate suspicions that Vance's investigation had unwittingly or deliberately provided intelligence that facilitated organized crime operations, but proving criminal conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt proved impossible, given the sophisticated compartmentalization that professional criminals use to insulate themselves from legal accountability for operations conducted through multiple intermediaries and legitimate-appearing business services. The rental car company that had provided the Nissan Altima to Raymond Burke under his false identification implemented enhanced customer verification procedures following the federal investigation that revealed how easily sophisticated criminals could exploit legitimate business services for criminal purposes. The procedural changes represented another small consequence of the traffic stop, affecting thousands of future rental transactions through verification requirements designed to prevent false identification from being used to obtain vehicles that could support criminal activities or flight from law enforcement. The ripple effects of Rowlerson's traffic stop extended across multiple domains of law enforcement and legitimate business operations, illustrating how single enforcement action could generate widespread consequences when it intersected with sophisticated criminal enterprises and federal investigations spanning multiple jurisdictions and criminal organizations. The cryptocurrency exchanges and financial institutions that had processed the transactions documented in Burke's electronic devices faced enhanced scrutiny from federal regulators seeking to prevent money laundering operations from exploiting digital financial systems that offered anonymity and international reach beyond traditional banking oversight. The regulatory changes represented policy responses to the type of criminal adaptation that Burke had exemplified through his ability to access and transfer assets despite witness protection restrictions designed to sever connections to previous financial activities. The policy evolution illustrated how individual criminal cases could influence broader regulatory frameworks when they revealed systematic vulnerabilities that required structural reforms rather than case-by-case enforcement responses. Federal prosecutors pointed to the Burke case and the evidence seized during Rollerson's traffic stop as justification for enhanced cryptocurrency regulation, using the investigation's findings to support arguments about the need for better monitoring of digital financial transactions that had become preferred method for international money laundering operations, seeking to avoid traditional banking systems compliance requirements and law enforcement access to transaction records. 12 years after the traffic stop that had transformed his career, Rollerson remained at the Florida Highway Patrol Academy training new generations of troopers about traffic stop procedures and the complex legal environments they would encounter during highway patrol duties. His lectures about the Alligator Alley traffic stop emphasized professional competence while acknowledging the unpredictable consequences that could result from routine enforcement actions when they intersected with federal investigations and sophisticated criminal organizations. The case had become legendary within Florida Highway Patrol as example of both professional excellence and the hidden costs of modern law enforcement, where routine duties could generate complications extending years beyond the initial enforcement action. New troopers listened to Rollerson's account with mixture of professional interest and concern about whether their own careers might be disrupted by similar encounters with complex criminal enterprises, using Florida's highway system for activities that would attract federal attention and potentially expose state troopers to threats and complications beyond traditional occupational dangers. The question that Rollerson could never definitively answer was whether he would have approached the traffic stop differently if he had somehow known the consequences that would follow from his professional observation of lane violations and his proper execution of standard investigation procedures after discovering fraudulent identification. His consistent response was that professional duty required him to enforce traffic laws and investigate suspicious circumstances regardless of potential complications. But privately, he wondered whether ignorance of future consequences had been blessing that allowed him to act professionally without the paralyzing awareness that routine decisions could generate life-altering implications. The philosophical question reflected broader tensions in modern law enforcement between professional obligations and personal security concerns that increasingly characterized officers' experiences as criminal sophistication evolved beyond traditional assumptions about contained risks and predictable career trajectories. Rollerson's inability to resolve the tension reflected fundamental uncertainties about balancing professional duty with personal preservation in environments where the two considerations could come into direct conflict through circumstances beyond any officer's reasonable ability to anticipate or control. Alligator Alley continued its function as a critical transportation corridor between Florida's coasts, its isolation and featureless landscape unchanged by the criminal investigations and assassination operations that had been triggered by one trooper's observation of lane violations during overnight patrol. The highway's reputation for driver fatigue and monotonous conditions that could induce highway hypnosis remained accurate. But for law enforcement officers aware of Rollerson's case, the highway also represented reminder that routine enforcement could expose them to consequences extending far beyond immediate traffic violations into territory involving federal jurisdiction, international criminal organizations, and threats that would affect their lives and careers for years after the initial enforcement action. The psychological burden of that awareness affected how some troopers approached their duties on Alligator Alley and other isolated highways, creating tension between professional obligations to enforce traffic laws thoroughly and personal desires to avoid complications that might result from discovering evidence connecting to complex federal investigations. The tension remained unresolved within Florida Highway Patrol culture years after Rowlerson's traffic stop, with officers developing individual approaches to balancing professional duty with security awareness based on their own risk tolerance and career priorities. Some troopers maintained aggressive traffic enforcement regardless of potential complications, while others adopted more cautious approaches that emphasized observable violations without extensive investigation that might reveal connections to complex criminal activities. The variation in enforcement approaches reflected legitimate differences in professional philosophy about whether law enforcement's primary obligation was thorough investigation regardless of consequences or strategic discretion that considered personal security implications when deciding whether to escalate routine encounters into extensive investigations that might connect to federal jurisdiction and sophisticated criminal organizations. Neither approach was clearly superior given the unpredictable nature of modern criminal activities and the impossibility of knowing which traffic stops might generate complications extending beyond immediate enforcement actions into territory requiring federal coordination and protective measures. The encrypted message that had initiated Rowlerson's awareness of threats following Burke's assassination remained saved in his personal files as a reminder of how quickly routine patrol duties could transform into security emergencies requiring protective responses and career modifications. The message represented physical evidence of the day his understanding of highway patrol had fundamentally changed from straightforward traffic enforcement to complex threat assessment involving organized crime intelligence and federal protective protocols. Rowlerson occasionally reviewed the message during reflective moments, using it as touchstone for understanding how his career had evolved from the simple motivations that had initially drawn him to highway patrol into the complicated reality of modern law enforcement, where professional competence could generate rather than prevent exposure to threats extending far beyond traditional occupational dangers. The message had never been deleted from secure FHP systems, serving as permanent documentation of the security environment that had forced Rowlerson's reassignment and illustrated the hidden costs of traffic enforcement in an era when sophisticated criminal organizations could transform routine stops into complex investigations, with unpredictable implications for officers whose only intention was enforcing traffic laws. Years after Burke's assassination, Rowlerson learned through federal contacts that the organized crime network responsible for the killing had been dismantled through prosecutions that built on intelligence gathered during the assassination investigation and subsequent surveillance of criminal associates, seeking to continue retaliation operations against witnesses in the money laundering cases. The successful prosecutions provided some closure but couldn't eliminate the career disruption and psychological burden that had resulted from Rowlerson's involvement in cases that had consumed over a year of his life and forced career trajectory changes that affected his professional identity and quality of life. The notification of successful prosecutions felt anticlimactic given the time that had passed and the permanent changes to Rowlerson's career that had resulted from threats that were now neutralized through federal enforcement actions that had occurred without his involvement or awareness until after completion. The delayed notification illustrated how federal investigations operated on timescales extending far beyond state law enforcement's typical case processing, creating situations where officers' lives were disrupted by threats that might be resolved through processes occurring without their knowledge or participation in jurisdictions and agencies far removed from their normal professional environments. Rowlerson's final reflection on the traffic stop that had defined his career involved acknowledgement that professional competence and personal security existed in tension, that modern law enforcement couldn't fully resolve through training, protocols, or institutional support. His experience illustrated fundamental uncertainties about consequences that could flow from routine duties when they intersected with criminal sophistication and federal jurisdiction, operating beyond traditional boundaries between traffic enforcement and complex investigations. The traffic stop had been professionally executed according to all standard procedures and legal requirements, yet it had generated complications that disrupted his career and created ongoing security concerns that affected his life years after the initial enforcement action. The paradox defied resolution through better training or different decisions, reflecting structural realities about modern criminal environments where any enforcement action could potentially connect to sophisticated enterprises whose resources and reach extended far beyond traditional law enforcement assumptions about contained risks and predictable consequences. On quiet nights, when darkness settled over the Everglades and Alligator Alley carried only scattered traffic between Florida's coasts, new generations of Florida Highway Patrol troopers conducted their patrols with awareness of Rowlerson's story and the possibility that routine traffic stops might expose them to complications extending far beyond immediate enforcement actions. The awareness created burden, but also professional maturity. Understanding that law enforcement in modern criminal environments required accepting risks that extended beyond traditional occupational dangers into territory where personal and professional lives could become indistinguishable targets for sophisticated adversaries. Mile marker 64 remained unmarked and indistinguishable from hundreds of other mile markers along the isolated highway, its significance known only to those familiar with Rowlerson's case and its implications for understanding modern highway patrol's intersection with federal investigations and organized crime operations. The highway continued its function, unchanged by the human dramas that had unfolded along its featureless corridor. Another reminder that criminal investigations and assassination operations represented only brief interruptions in infrastructure that served millions of travelers pursuing legitimate purposes across Florida's challenging geography. Somewhere in federal witness protection, former associates of Raymond Burke, who had testified in subsequent prosecutions, lived under new identities with awareness that cooperation with law enforcement carried permanent costs extending beyond immediate legal proceedings into lifelong security concerns, requiring constant vigilance and acceptance of disrupted personal lives. Their experiences paralleled Rowlerson's in different contexts, illustrating how federal investigations consumed participants regardless of whether they were criminal cooperators or law enforcement officers whose only connection was professional execution of routine duties during circumstances that happened to intersect with complex criminal enterprises. The parallel experiences suggested that modern criminal sophistication had evolved beyond law enforcement's ability to protect all participants in prosecutions from lasting consequences, creating environments where cooperation and professional duty carried costs that institutional support could mitigate but never eliminate completely. The reality imposed psychological burden on law enforcement officers considering how thoroughly to investigate suspicious circumstances during routine stops, knowing that discoveries connecting to federal jurisdiction might generate complications affecting their lives for years after the initial enforcement actions. The story that began with lane violations observed during overnight patrol on Alligator Alley ended without resolution or redemption, only accommodation to realities that challenged traditional assumptions about highway patrol's relatively benign dangers compared to more obviously hazardous law enforcement specializations. Rowlerson's career had been permanently altered by professional competence rather than mistakes, creating cautionary example about unpredictable consequences in modern criminal environments where sophisticated organizations could transform routine enforcement into complex investigations with implications extending across international borders and multiple agencies. The lack of satisfying conclusion reflected modern law enforcement's reality, where cases rarely ended cleanly, but instead generated cascading consequences affecting multiple lives across timescales measuring years or decades, rather than the immediate resolution that characterized traditional criminal justice narratives. For troopers patrolling Florida's isolated highways, Raulerson's experience remained a permanent reminder that no traffic stop was truly routine once criminal sophistication reached levels that could exploit any enforcement action for purposes extending far beyond immediate violations into territory involving organized crime retaliation, federal investigations, and threats that would affect officers' lives long after the traffic violators had been processed through criminal justice systems.